Welcome back, everyone, to the channel where we dive deep into the stories you thought you knew and uncover the ones you never saw coming. This is not your usual Family Guy episode breakdown. We're peeling back the layers of humor, revealing the hidden drama, the whispered rumors, and the secrets that never made it to air. From subtle background details to the most shocking fan theories, you're about to see the Griffin family in a way that might just change how you watch the show forever. Buckle up. This is going to be a wild one. The night always seemed heavier in Quahog when you looked at it through the lens of secrecy. The streets that usually brimmed with slapstick absurdity and cartoonish chaos took on a different shade when the doors closed, the curtains drew, and the laughter faded into the distance. It was in those moments, in the stillness between episodes, that the real stories lingered, the ones the show never quite dared to tell outright. Stories of quiet betrayals, hidden desires, and unspoken pacts, woven into the fabric of a town that thrived on eccentricity, but lived in the shadows of its own contradictions. This wasn't the Quahog of bright daylight and loud punchlines. No, this was Quahog after hours, when the clinking of glasses in the drunken clam faded into murmurs, and the houses stood still like sentinels guarding secrets too delicate to touch. And as with any small town, those secrets had a way of binding people together or tearing them apart behind closed doors. The Griffin house was no stranger to such moments. From the outside, it looked the same as it always had, a cheerful yellow facade, a white-trimmed roof, and the kind of suburban charm that suggested stability. But inside, past the laughter and the endless parade of bizarre misadventures, there were layers, moments that never quite made it into the holiday cards, glances exchanged across rooms, words left hanging in the air, memories that clung like cobwebs in the corners of the mind. And sometimes, the line between secret and truth blurred so thoroughly that even the people living it weren't sure where one ended and the other began. Peter Griffin, for instance, was not a man known for subtlety. His life was a collage of brash decisions, loud opinions, and questionable schemes. But even he had compartments, little drawers in the attic of his mind where he stored things he'd never admit to Lois, to his friends, or even to himself. Some of those drawers were filled with harmless embarrassments. Others were locked a little tighter. Lois, on the other hand, was a study in contradictions. Outwardly refined, composed, and endlessly patient with her husband's antics, she was also a woman with her own shadowed corridors. Moments from her past, decisions she'd made, temptations she'd tasted. If Peter's secrets were scattered like loose change, Lois's were fine silver locked in a velvet-lined box, hidden, deliberate, and precious in their own dangerous way. And then there was Brian, the intellectual, the cynic, the hopeless romantic. His secrets weren't always malicious, but they were plentiful, like half-finished manuscripts, tucked in drawers, or phone numbers, saved under false names. He walked a delicate balance between moral superiority and personal indulgence, often dipping a toe or diving headfirst into things he knew he shouldn't. But perhaps the most haunting thing about Quahog's secrets was that they were never truly buried. In a town where neighbors peered through blinds, where bar conversations spilled too easily, and where every mistake had a way of surfacing, secrecy was less about hiding the truth and more about knowing when to admit it or when to look the other way. One evening, long after the sun had slipped below the horizon, a faint light glowed in the Griffin living room. The rest of the house was quiet. Stewie was asleep, Chris was snoring upstairs, and Meg was in her room, earbuds in, lost in music that masked the noise of the world outside. Lois sat alone on the couch, the blue light of the television washing over her face. She wasn't watching anything in particular. The channel had been left on some late-night rerun. Her eyes were focused somewhere far beyond the screen. In her hand, she held a small envelope, plain, white, unmarked. She had found it tucked under the door earlier that day, but had waited until everyone was distracted before she even dared to pick it up. Now, in the stillness of the night, she slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a single folded page. The handwriting was neat, too neat, and the message was short. I know what you did. Meet me at the pier tomorrow. Midnight. Her heart gave the smallest jolt. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, the sudden, cold awareness of vulnerability. She didn't know whether to laugh or feel alarmed. People in Quahog had strange senses of humor, but the way the message was written, no name, no context, told her this was not a joke. She folded the letter again, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it under the cushion beside her. Her mind started retracing every step, every choice, every moment from the past year that could lead to such a note. There were a few possibilities. Upstairs in his room, Peter was wide awake too, though for a very different reason. He sat at the edge of his bed holding a photograph he thought he had thrown away years ago. It was worn, creased from being folded too many times, and in it, he stood with two people he hadn't seen in a long time. He couldn't even remember the exact year it was taken, but he remembered the night vividly, not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. Peter wasn't the kind of man who kept sentimental mementos, but this picture was different. This picture wasn't about nostalgia, it was a reminder, a tether to something he swore he'd never talk about. He heard Lois moving downstairs and quickly slid the photo into a drawer. Secrets had a way of becoming heavier when you were alone with them. Meanwhile, across town, Brian sat at the bar in the Drunken Clam, nursing a drink that had long since gone warm. The crowd had thinned out, leaving only a few regulars scattered at the tables. He stared at the condensation on his glass, tracing shapes with his finger, lost in a memory he couldn't quite shake. There was a number saved in his phone that he'd been meaning to delete, a number that belonged to someone he wasn't supposed to call. But every time his thumb hovered over the delete button, he found a reason not to. Quahog slept, but the weight of these unspoken truths lingered. The air seemed thicker. The moonlight spilled across empty streets like a silent witness. And somewhere, in the quiet space between thought and action, each of them knew the past had a way of catching up. Tomorrow night would bring answers, or maybe just more questions. Either way, the pier would not be empty. But inside the Griffin household, these bonds, though unspoken, played their own game of power, loyalty, and betrayal. It wasn't the kind of family dynamic you could diagram neatly or explain in a psychology textbook. Instead, it was a shifting tide. One day, alliances formed naturally, Lois and Stewie teaming up against Peter's latest reckless stunt, or Peter siding with Chris in a silly rebellion against Lois's rules. The next day, those alliances would fracture, replaced with entirely new ones. And through all of it, the air seemed to hum with an unspoken truth. Behind every laugh was the shadow of something left unsaid. The kitchen often became the stage for these subtler tensions. Over breakfast, the smell of burnt toast and sizzling bacon might mingle with an awkward silence after someone made a remark that cut a little too close. Lois, pouring coffee into her mug, might glance at Peter, not with anger exactly, but with a quiet calculation, like she was measuring how much she should let slide today. Meg, hunched over her cereal bowl, would sometimes risk a comment, only to be met with an eye roll or a dismissive grunt. Chris, somewhere in between obliviousness and sensitivity, would sometimes sense the undercurrent, but never quite know what to do about it. And Stewie, sharp-eyed, always listening, absorbed every detail like a sponge, storing it away for reasons he might not even fully understand. Outside the home, these hidden dynamics often revealed themselves in subtle, almost accidental ways. At social gatherings, the Griffins presented themselves as a chaotic but lovable unit. But if you look closely, you might notice the moments when someone hesitated before speaking, or when a joke seemed to hit a nerve. These weren't the big, dramatic conflicts you'd expect from a family hiding dark secrets. They were smaller, quieter cracks in the foundation, the ones that, over time, could widen into something harder to ignore. One of the most interesting things about the Griffins was how often these cracks were patched over, not with apologies, but with humor. A biting comment might be softened with a sarcastic quip. A moment of awkwardness might be diffused by shifting the conversation to some absurd piece of news or gossip. It was as if everyone had silently agreed that laughter was their version of a peace treaty. It didn't erase the tension, but it kept things moving forward, kept the machine of the household running, at least for another day. And yet beneath all of this, there were questions that no one dared to voice out loud. Did Peter ever truly understand the toll his recklessness took on Lois? Did Lois, despite her outward frustration, secretly thrive on the chaos Peter brought into their lives? Was Meg's bitterness the result of years of neglect, or had it grown into something more complicated? A defense mechanism she wasn't ready to give up? Was Chris truly as oblivious as he seemed? Or did he simply choose not to confront certain truths? And Stewie, did he observe all of this purely for his own amusement, or was he, in his own strange way, trying to understand what family really meant? The Griffin house, for all its noise and commotion, was built on a fragile kind of equilibrium. It could survive Peter's impulsive adventures, Lois's moments of discontent, Meg's bitterness, Chris's confusion, and Stewie's plotting. But the real danger, the real fragility, came from what they didn't say. Those unsaid things, those unspoken agreements, and quiet resentments. They formed the invisible threads that held the family together and kept them apart in equal measure. And in that way, behind closed doors wasn't just a metaphor. It was the truest description of their lives. Because the moment those doors shut, the moment the outside world was locked away, the Griffins became something else entirely. They became a family defined not just by the things they shared, but by the things they kept hidden. And if you stayed long enough, listened closely enough, you'd start to hear the faint echoes of those secrets in every joke, every sigh, every glance across the dinner table. Evening in Quahog had a way of changing the atmosphere inside the house. The light would fade to a warm amber glow through the curtains, and the television's chatter would fill the space with a kind of background comfort. But when the show or movie ended, and the room fell quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge, the silences became more noticeable. Sometimes those silences were peaceful, everyone lost in their own thoughts. Other times they were heavy, like the quiet before a storm. In those moments, a single sentence could shift everything, either diffusing the tension or igniting it. One night in particular stood out. Peter had been unusually quiet all evening, something Lois noticed almost immediately. She didn't press him about it, not yet. Instead, she kept the dinner conversation light, chatting with Chris about school and tossing a few half-hearted comments toward Meg, who, as always, seemed skeptical of the effort. Stewie sat in his high chair, feigning disinterest while watching every interaction with careful attention. Then, just as they were clearing the table, Peter spoke up, not loudly, but in a tone that carried weight. "You ever think," he said almost absently, "that we're not as close as we used to be?" The words hung in the air, startling in their simplicity. Lois froze for a fraction of a second, then forced a small laugh. "Oh, Peter, we're just busy, that's all." But her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, something like worry. Meg, surprisingly, didn't roll her eyes or make a sarcastic comment. Instead, she looked at her father for a long moment before looking away. Chris shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between his parents. And Stewie, though he didn't speak, leaned forward just slightly, as if trying to catch every nuance of the moment. The conversation moved on quickly after that. Lois made sure of it. But the echo of Peter's question lingered. It was one of those moments that everyone remembered, even if they pretended they didn't. And in a strange way, it revealed one of the most important truths about the Griffins. Beneath all the chaos, all the absurdity, there was a genuine awareness that their bonds, fragile as they might be, were worth holding on to. In the days that followed, life in the Griffin household returned to its usual rhythm. Peter's quiet moment was filed away alongside countless other half-forgotten exchanges. But something about it lingered in the background, like a song you can't quite get out of your head. And for Stewie, who had been listening with an intensity no one else noticed, it became a point of fascination. Because for all his scheming and mischief, he understood something fundamental. Even the strongest walls can have cracks, and sometimes the most revealing thing about a family isn't what they show the world. It's what they try to hide from each other. In the dim hush of Quahog's quieter hours, when the streetlights hum faintly against the evening air and most of the neighborhood has retreated indoors, the Griffin house can appear deceptively still. A casual passerby might see only the harmless outline of a suburban home, a worn driveway, a tidy lawn, the faint glow of a TV screen spilling through the living room curtains. But beneath that familiar shell lies a world far from ordinary, a place where secrets take root in whispers, and where moments that seem laughable on the surface often conceal something far more complicated. The Griffin family. Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian have spent years living within these walls, each playing their role in the chaotic comedy of their lives. But behind those roles lie parts of themselves that rarely see the light. It's in the quiet moments, when no one's looking, that you catch the flicker of something deeper. Peter's laugh masking insecurities, Lois's calm smile concealing regrets, Stewie's sharp wit doubling as armor against his own vulnerabilities. And then there's Meg, often dismissed, often ignored, who has seen and heard more than most realize. If you've ever watched the family interact, you know the rhythms well. The banter, the bickering, the absurd, larger-than-life adventures that somehow end with them back at the kitchen table as if nothing happened. But what about the nights when the laughter dies down and no one's trying to be funny? Those are the moments the story will follow, the hushed conversations, the secrets traded in the dark, the memories that are too fragile to be spoken aloud in daylight. It begins with Meg. In the dim glow of her bedroom lamp, she sits cross-legged on her bed, her phone screen lighting up her face. The faint buzz of notifications comes and goes. Most of them unimportant, a group chat she doesn't really participate in, a reminder for an assignment she's half forgotten, a store coupon she'll never use. But then there's the message she's been waiting for, the one that makes her chest tighten. It's from someone who shouldn't be texting her this late, someone whose attention makes her feel seen in a way she's not used to. She reads the words once, then again, the corners of her mouth tugging upward in the smallest of smiles before she types back a careful reply. Meanwhile, downstairs, Lois is pacing the kitchen in the half-dark, her slippers soft against the linoleum. There's restless energy to her tonight, the kind that comes when your mind refuses to shut off. On the counter sits a half-empty glass of wine, a neglected magazine, and her phone face down as though she doesn't want to be tempted by it. She keeps glancing toward the stairs, not because she's expecting anyone, but because part of her is hoping she won't be alone in her thoughts for much longer. Peter is already asleep on the couch in the living room, the faint sound of his snoring blending with the late-night infomercials flickering on the TV. It's a familiar sight, the way his head tilts back, the way one hand dangles toward the floor, the way he seems perfectly at peace in that moment. But even Peter has his moments of quiet doubt, the ones that creep in between jokes when no one's around to see. Those moments don't happen often, and when they do, he buries them quickly under another laugh. Upstairs, Stewie is awake in his crib, lying on his back and staring at the ceiling. His mind is too busy for sleep, and though his expression is calm, the gears are turning in ways no one around him could guess. He's been listening, as he always does, catching snippets of conversation, changes in tone, movements through the house. He notices the small things, the way Meg's footsteps sounded hesitant earlier, the way Lois's pacing downstairs has a certain edge to it. In Stewie's world, every little detail could be a clue to something worth uncovering. And then there's Brian, curled in his dog bed, but very much awake. His eyes shift toward the kitchen doorway every so often, as though debating whether to get up and join Lois, maybe offer a bit of late-night company. But he stays put for now, comfortable in the quiet, letting his mind drift to the kinds of thoughts he doesn't voice aloud about past mistakes, fleeting happiness, and the strange comfort of knowing everyone in this house is just as imperfect as he is. From the outside, the Griffin home still looks ordinary. But inside, these private moments are unfolding, each one separate, yet all connected by invisible threads. Secrets don't have to be grand or shocking to matter. Sometimes they're as simple as the text Meg just sent, the quiet tension in Lois's steps, or the unspoken thoughts Brian keeps to himself. These are the bonds no one talks about, the ones that aren't for public display. And in a place like Quahog, where absurdity is the norm and chaos is never far away, maybe these small, hidden truths are the most fragile things they have. The real question is how long they can stay hidden, and what will happen when the walls between them start to crack. If you listen closely tonight past the hum of the TV, past the sound of distant traffic, you might hear the faint, overlapping heartbeat of a family that's far more complicated than it looks. You might notice the way shadows stretch across the walls in strange shapes, or how the stillness of the air seems to hold a secret of its own. It's in those moments that the Griffin house feels almost alive, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Because behind closed doors, nothing stays still for long. The Griffin's home, despite its cartoonish facade and cheerful pastel paint, seemed to harbor pockets of reality far darker than its inhabitants often admitted. Some of these shadows were born from petty grudges, others from silent resentment, and some from the kind of emotional fractures that could only be seen when the laughter had long faded and the living room fell into an uneasy hush. On a night when the wind outside rattled the old siding, the family gathered in front of the TV, not for a shared activity, but more like separate islands sitting in the same ocean. Lois was thumbing through a magazine. Peter was half watching some bizarre late-night infomercial. Chris was doodling absent-mindedly, and Meg was staring at the reflection of the flickering screen in the darkened window, lost somewhere beyond the glass. It was these small, quiet moments that often revealed the most. Meg had become an expert at existing without taking up space. Years of ridicule from her father, apathy from her mother, and cold indifference from her peers had conditioned her into a presence that could disappear at will. But inside, the storm still raged. In that reflection, her eyes weren't watching the TV at all. They were replaying scenes from a childhood she barely got to enjoy. Lois glanced over at her daughter, perhaps sensing that vacant look, but quickly returned to her magazine. Lois wasn't cruel by nature, but her role in the house was as much about survival as anyone else's. And sometimes survival meant letting certain emotional fires burn out on their own. Meg, unfortunately, was often the one holding the matches. In the kitchen, Stewie had stationed himself at the table, sketching diagrams for some intricate new invention. Something he claimed would finally make the family see the error of their ways. Brian, leaning lazily against the counter, was reading over his shoulder with mild curiosity. "You know, Stewie," Brian said, "this is either going to be a revolution or a lawsuit waiting to happen." Stewie didn't look up. "And yet, I find both outcomes equally satisfying." What Brian didn't realize was that Stewie wasn't entirely talking about mechanical inventions. The youngest Griffin often picked up on the undercurrents in the house, the unspoken grievances and private grudges. And lately those undercurrents had been pulling stronger, tugging everyone into silent conflict. Later that evening, when Peter had finally shuffled off to bed and Lois retreated upstairs, the house felt bigger, emptier. Meg sat at the kitchen table alone, tracing circles on the wood with her fingertip. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, and for a moment she thought about standing up, grabbing her jacket, and just walking until she didn't recognize the streets anymore. But she didn't. She stayed. Because leaving wasn't the problem, coming back was. The truth was, Meg had tried disappearing before, if only for a few hours at a time. She'd take her car and drive aimlessly, park somewhere far from home, and just sit in silence. But every time she came back, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't think of anywhere else she'd be wanted either. And in a way, that was the Griffin family's curse. They fought, insulted, ignored and undermined each other, but in the end, they always returned to the same table, the same couch, the same cramped kitchen. Love wasn't always loud here. Sometimes it was buried so deep under sarcasm and neglect that you had to dig for weeks just to see a flicker of it. On nights like this, Meg wondered if that flicker was even worth finding. Outside, the streets of Quahog lay still, their lamplight spilling in lonely pools across the pavement. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed, a reminder that even in this small town, everyone had their own emergencies, their own crises hidden from view. And inside the Griffin home, the same rule applied. The problems weren't gone. They were simply tucked away behind closed doors. Stewie wandered in then, his small steps light against the linoleum. He climbed into the chair across from Meg without saying a word, just watching her. For a moment his eyes softened, not with pity, but with a kind of mutual recognition. He knew what it felt like to live in a house full of people who didn't always listen. "You know," Stewie said quietly, "you could just stop caring what they think." Meg gave a tired laugh. "Easier said than done." "Yes, well," Stewie replied, sliding off the chair. "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, and if you ever want to build a device that erases selective memories, you know where to find me." When he left, Meg sat there for a long time, unsure if he was joking. Upstairs, the muffled sound of Peter's snores leaked through the ceiling. Lois's faint footsteps moved from room to room, probably checking on Chris or folding laundry. Life in the Griffin household always carried on, even when its foundation felt shaky. The darkest truths were never shouted here. They were whispered, tucked away, or disguised as a joke. But the walls remembered everything, and so did Meg. The conversations at the dinner table had once been casual, scattered with playful teasing and occasional bickering, but now they were like loaded traps, every word carrying a hidden implication, every glance silently communicating something unspoken. Chris seemed oblivious most of the time, shoveling food into his mouth with a teenage hunger that shielded him from the darker emotional undertones. But Meg noticed. She always noticed. Maybe it was because she had grown used to feeling invisible, and invisibility made you observant. You saw what others didn't want you to see. You learned to read the silences as much as the words. Meg began to piece things together, not through eavesdropping, but through the patterns. Why Lois suddenly changed the subject when certain topics came up. Why Peter grew quieter after certain phone calls. Why there were nights when Lois didn't come to bed until far later than usual. Her mind didn't jump to betrayal immediately. Instead, it wandered into confusion. Were her parents hiding something from her? From each other? Or was this just the natural erosion of a marriage, the slow drifting apart that she'd seen in the homes of some of her friends? Stewie, on the other hand, didn't need to piece together anything. He already knew. Or at least, he suspected enough to be entertained by the idea. To him, this was like watching a live-action soap opera unfold in his own home. And the best part was that nobody knew he was paying attention. He lingered just a little longer in the hallway when Lois thought she was alone in the kitchen. He'd perch himself on the couch armrest when Peter answered the phone in the living room, pretending to focus on a toy while actually studying Peter's tone and expression. But what fascinated Stewie wasn't just the secrecy, it was the performance. Both Peter and Lois were working so hard to maintain the illusion of normalcy that it was almost impressive. Meals were still made, birthdays still celebrated, and family outings still planned. Yet beneath it all was a tension that even Stewie's young mind recognized as unsustainable. One late evening, long after Meg and Chris had gone to bed, Lois found herself in the kitchen with only the sound of the ticking clock for company. The moonlight cut across the floor, making the shadows longer and more pronounced. She sat at the table, fingers curled around a lukewarm mug of tea, staring into the steam as though it could offer answers. She didn't hear Peter come in until he was leaning against the doorway. His expression was unreadable, and for a few moments neither of them spoke. It wasn't an argument, not that night, just a mutual acknowledgement of the silence between them. But silence has weight, and over time, it presses down. In the weeks that followed, the cracks in their performance widened. Peter's jokes didn't land the way they used to. Lois's patience wore thinner with each passing day. They still loved each other, at least in some sense. But there was something between them now, a shadow they couldn't quite name aloud. And if they did name it, they feared what the truth might mean. Meg began staying out later, lingering at the homes of friends or in the quiet corners of the library, not because she was rebelling, but because the atmosphere at home felt heavy. She told herself she didn't care, that she had learned long ago to expect nothing from her family, but a small part of her ached for the home she used to imagine they could be. Stewie, meanwhile, was growing restless. Secrets were fun when they were unfolding, but this one was dragging on without resolution. He wanted a climax, a revelation, something explosive. Yet part of him knew that whatever was brewing wasn't going to end in fireworks. It would end in a slow, quiet unraveling. And strangely, that was even more unsettling. It wasn't until one rainy evening, when the patter against the windows made the whole house feel smaller, that things reached a subtle breaking point. Not a fight, not even raised voices, just a look, a long, unbroken look between Peter and Lois as they sat across from each other at the dinner table. And for reasons none of them could quite explain, that look changed everything. The air in Quahog has always carried a certain heaviness at night, a blend of ocean salt, old brick, and quiet stories tucked into its shadows. Some streets wear their histories openly, the cracks in their sidewalks telling tales of small-town scandals and whispered regrets. But others guard their truths behind shuttered windows and fences that seem more for the soul than the yard. This is where our story continues, in the quiet corners of the Griffin household, where the line between family love and family distance is more fragile than anyone likes to admit. Meg Griffin, for so long the punchline of her own existence, had learned to navigate the emotional maze of her home like someone memorizing the creaks in a floorboard. You don't just walk through the Griffin house. You move carefully, reading the room before you enter, gauging whether your presence will be tolerated or ignored. For Meg, this wasn't just habit. It was survival. It wasn't that her family hated her, not exactly. Hate requires energy, passion even. And the Griffins had never given her that much. Their neglect was quieter, subtler, like a draft that seeps in no matter how tightly you shut the windows. She could sit at the dinner table and speak, and her words would dissolve in the air before they reached anyone's ears. She could announce a personal victory, and it would be swallowed whole by a louder, flashier story from someone else. Over time, she stopped expecting acknowledgement. Yet in the stillness of her room, when the walls became her only witnesses, Meg had her own universe. Posters on the walls weren't just decorations. They were doorways to imagined futures where she was more than a ghost in her own life. She could picture herself standing on stages, commanding crowds who knew her name. Not because they were laughing at her, but because they wanted to listen. And in that quiet, she let herself believe that being unseen didn't mean she didn't matter. Outside her door, the Griffin house was alive in its own strange, chaotic rhythm. Lois could be heard in the kitchen, cleaning with the kind of force that came from needing to distract herself. Peter's laughter rumbled from the living room, television light flashing across his face, as he lost himself in something loud and ridiculous. Stewie's soft plodding muttered through the baby monitor, and Chris's heavy footsteps moved clumsily in the hallway. Each sound was familiar, but together they made a kind of noise that didn't quite feel like home. Meg would sometimes sit on her bed, knees pulled up, and listen. Not to feel connected, but to remind herself that the world outside her room still spun. There was safety in the predictability of it, even if it wasn't warm. And yet, on certain nights, when the wind outside rattled the branches against her window, she felt the weight of everything left unsaid, pressing closer. It's strange, the secrets a house can keep. Not the dramatic ones, no hidden vaults, no locked attic rooms, but the slow, invisible kind. Resentments that never get spoken out loud. Small betrayals that happen in the form of forgetting someone's story, or never asking for it in the first place. The Griffin family had plenty of those, and Meg knew most of them by heart. She had learned to read between the lines of conversations, to feel when the air shifted. Her mother, for instance, had dreams once. Big, bright dreams that had been traded in for grocery lists and carpool schedules. Meg had caught glimpses of them in old photos, in the way Lois's smile was different in her 20s, like it came from somewhere deeper. But those moments were locked away now, replaced by a kind of carefully managed efficiency. Sometimes Meg wondered if her mother saw a younger version of herself in her. And if that was the reason, she kept her at a distance. Peter, on the other hand, was harder to read. He was a loud, bumbling presence, a man who seemed allergic to serious conversations. And yet Meg had caught moments, fleeting, unguarded moments, where his expression shifted, where the laughter seemed to cover something else entirely. But he never let her close enough to know for sure. The truth was, Meg was the keeper of these tiny observations because no one else paid close enough attention to notice them. She saw the cracks because she was always looking up from the floor, always on the outside of the circle. And in some strange way, that gave her a perspective no one else in the family had. Still, perspective doesn't warm you at night. It doesn't make the quiet hurt any less. Meg would sometimes think about what it would be like if she just left. Not in some dramatic runaway fantasy, but in a quiet, unannounced way, packing a bag, walking out the door, and simply not coming back. She wondered how long it would take before someone noticed. Would it be hours, days, weeks? The thought didn't always come from sadness. Sometimes it was curiosity, an experiment in her mind. But other times, it came from the deep ache of wanting to know if her absence could ever feel as loud as her presence felt small. But then life had a strange way of keeping her anchored here. Little things, a shared laugh with Chris over something stupid, Stewie accidentally falling asleep against her arm, Lois handing her a plate of food without a word, were small threads, but threads nonetheless. And maybe that was enough to keep her tethered. Tonight, she sat by her window, the cool glass pressing against her forehead, and watched the quiet street below. A single street lamp flickered, its glow catching in the puddles left by the afternoon rain. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the sound felt like it belonged to a world entirely separate from hers. She thought about all the lives happening out there, neighbors she'd never meet, stories she'd never be part of. And yet here she was, in a house that was both her cage and her shelter. Sometimes she thought the Griffin home wasn't just a place. It was a living thing. It breathed with them, carried their secrets, and absorbed their silences. The walls had heard every argument, every whispered confession, every unspoken resentment. And maybe, in some strange way, it understood her better than her own family did. Meg took a slow breath, the kind you take when you're trying to hold something inside, and let her gaze drift upward. Beyond the rooftops, the night sky stretched endlessly. Stars scattered like a map with no clear destination. Somewhere out there was a place where she belonged, a place where she wouldn't be the forgotten one. But for now, she stayed here, in the room that had become both her sanctuary and her reminder. And perhaps that was the truest secret of all, that even in the most familiar places there can be entire worlds hidden behind closed doors. There's a certain strange comfort in the way the Griffin household carries its chaos, like a constantly shifting stage play where every actor knows their role, yet sometimes strays into a scene they were never meant to be in. And if the kitchen is the place where daily battles are fought over burnt toast and questionable coffee, then the living room is the theater where unspoken truths quietly take their seats. On a seemingly ordinary evening, the hum of the television filled the room with canned laughter, the glow bouncing across the worn fabric of the couch. Lois sat at one end, her posture neat, hands folded over her lap as though waiting for a conversation that had yet to begin. Peter lounged at the other end, his attention only partially on the show, his eyes occasionally darting to Lois with that familiar, almost sheepish curiosity. Brian was curled up on the armchair, a book resting between his paws, its title hidden, though the faint smirk on his face suggested it was something he wouldn't openly read if the kids were in the room. Stewie sat cross-legged on the floor, blocks arranged in an unnervingly precise pattern before him. He wasn't building anything. Not really. He was arranging them like a general mapping out a battlefield. Meg and Chris hovered in the doorway, each leaning on a different side of the frame. It wasn't often that all of them occupied the same space without someone storming off within 5 minutes. Yet here they were, still quiet, almost as if they were all waiting for a single moment to break the spell. And then it happened. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a simple, low comment from Lois, spoken with the kind of casual delivery that often hides far deeper intent. "You know," she said, not looking away from the TV, "sometimes I wonder if we actually know each other at all." The words hung there. Peter chuckled awkwardly. "Of course we do, Lois. We're married, remember? Got the papers and everything." Brian's smirk faltered. Stewie froze mid-reach for one of his blocks. Meg and Chris exchanged a glance, one of those quick, silent communication siblings learned from years of navigating the same unpredictable family weather. Lois didn't respond right away. Her eyes stayed on the screen, but it was clear she wasn't watching. "Living together isn't the same as knowing someone," she finally said. "Sometimes I think we only see the versions of each other we want to see in the safe versions." Peter shifted uncomfortably. "Safe versions are good. Safe versions don't yell at you for forgetting to take out the trash." But her point had already planted itself in the room. Stewie, ever the opportunist when it came to psychological tension, leaned forward slightly, his interest sharpening. "Fascinating," he murmured under his breath, though not so quietly that Brian couldn't hear. Brian, sensing the undercurrent, closed his book and rested it on the arm of the chair. "She's not wrong," he said, his tone calm, almost detached. "We all hide things. Little things, big things. Sometimes it's just easier that way." Chris frowned, looking between them. "Like secrets?" "Exactly," Brian replied. "Not all secrets are bad, but some—" He let the thought trail off, letting implication do the heavy lifting. Peter crossed his arms, clearly unsettled. "I don't have secrets. I'm an open book. Everyone knows I once ate an entire wedding cake because I thought it was a display model." Lois turned her head toward him now, her gaze steady but not unkind. "Peter, not all secrets are silly stories you tell at parties." The living room seemed smaller in that moment, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Each person, in their own way, carried something they would never willingly lay bare in front of the others. Even Stewie, especially Stewie, knew that certain truths were like live wires. Once exposed, they sparked uncontrollably. Meg finally broke the tension with a hesitant laugh. "This is weird. Are we just going to sit here and talk about secrets now, like some kind of messed up trust exercise?" Brian tilted his head toward her. "Maybe we should. You'd be surprised how much people reveal when they think no one's judging them." The room was still again, save for the faint sound of the TV and the occasional creak of the house settling. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly casting moving shadows across the walls, like ghosts making their rounds. Lois shifted her posture, almost as if settling into a new role. "All right," she said softly. "If we're going to talk about secrets, then maybe we should start with something small, something safe." She looked at Peter. "You go first." Peter looked like a deer caught in headlights. Okay. He tapped his chin. "Well, I once told Joe I couldn't help him move his couch because I had a dentist appointment, but I didn't. I was just at home watching monster truck videos on YouTube." Chris snorted. "Wow, Dad. Really deep stuff there." Lois smiled faintly. "It's not about the size of the secret. It's about whether you're willing to share." Brian stretched and leaned back. "Fine. I'll bite. A few years ago, I sort of borrowed Quagmire's car for a night without telling him." Peter blinked. "Borrowed? Like stole?" "Borrowed," Brian repeated firmly. "And I brought it back, mostly undamaged." Stewie rolled his eyes. "Oh, riveting. Shall I go next, or will you all continue exchanging your pitiful half-truths?" Lois raised an eyebrow. "You have something to share, Stewie?" He smiled that small, unsettling smile he reserved for moments when he was in full control of the narrative. Mother, if I truly revealed one of my secrets, the delicate fabric of this household would unravel faster than your patience during a PTA meeting. So for now, I'll abstain. The quiet laughter that followed wasn't entirely comfortable. There was a shared awareness now, a shift. These weren't just idle confessions. They were glimpses into the edges of deeper truths, the kind that, if followed too far, could lead somewhere the family might not be ready to go. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the window. Inside, the Griffins sat together in a rare, fragile stillness, each holding a piece of themselves just out of reach from the others, as though they all knew, whether they admitted it or not, that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Meg Griffin's struggles were rarely about just one thing. They were never confined neatly to a single incident or a single person's opinion. Instead, they layered on top of each other like a stack of heavy, unsteady boxes, each one tipping a little more under the weight of the next. The surface-level moments, the teasing, the cutting remarks from her own family, the way classmates treated her like a non-entity, were only the most visible symptoms. Beneath those, there was an invisible scaffolding of repeated dismissals, moments when she tried to speak and was either ignored or laughed at, and times when she dared to hope and was reminded why she shouldn't. And yet, what made Meg different from what others assumed was that she didn't walk through life completely defeated. People mistook her silence for surrender, but it was more like strategic endurance. She had this internal clock, this unspoken belief that there might be a time, maybe not soon, but someday, when the balance would shift. Until then, she learned to live within the noise, to navigate the chaos, and to carve out little private corners of joy that no one could reach to spoil. One of those corners was the old treehouse in the backyard. Nobody in the Griffin household seemed to care about it anymore, but Meg had claimed it for herself. It was her hideaway, her sanctuary from the constant barrage of interruptions and insults inside the house. She'd keep a blanket up there, a stash of snacks, and a small box filled with letters she'd written but never sent. Letters to celebrities, to old friends who had drifted away, even to future versions of herself. They weren't polished or perfect. Most were written in a scrawl during moments when her emotions spilled over. But the act of writing them was grounding. It was her way of telling herself, I exist. I matter. I have a voice, even if no one hears it right now. It was in these quiet spaces that Meg confronted the deeper, more complicated emotions that came with being constantly undervalued. There was hurt, yes, but also this strange mixture of longing and resilience. She wanted to be liked. She wanted to be seen. But she also developed an unexpected strength from surviving without those things. That strength was subtle. She didn't carry it like armor, didn't use it to lash back, but it was there in the way she kept showing up to life, even when life seemed uninterested in showing up for her. School was no gentler. Walking into James Woods Regional High felt like walking into a stage play where everyone else had memorized their lines and she hadn't even been given a script. The cliques had their rhythms, their jokes, their own unspoken rules. Meg floated between them, never quite landing, always on the periphery. Her friends were few, and even they sometimes joined in the teasing when the pressure of fitting in became too much. Meg rarely called them out for it. She understood that in high school, self-preservation often came at the expense of someone else's dignity. What kept her going wasn't the fantasy of some grand transformation. No magical makeover that would suddenly make her popular, but rather the idea that there was more to life than the small, confining world of her teenage years. In those private moments, she could almost see it, a version of herself who had left Quahog, who was living somewhere else entirely, surrounded by people who didn't know the Meg Griffin they all thought they knew. The version of her who wore clothes because she liked them, not because they were on clearance. The version of her who could speak without bracing for laughter. And yet, there was still a quiet ache when she imagined that life, because in order to get there, she'd have to carry the scars of what she had endured. She'd have to carry the voice in her head that whispered every cruel thing she'd ever heard about herself. Sometimes late at night, she wondered if she'd ever be free of it, or if she would just learn to talk over it. Family gatherings were perhaps the most revealing of her situation. They were supposed to be moments of connection, but for Meg, they often felt like a reminder of her role in the Griffin hierarchy. Conversations would swirl around her without truly including her. Peter's loud stories, Lois's subtle exasperation, Chris's oblivious remarks. It was all part of the background noise she had grown used to. Every so often, she'd try to join in, offer a thought or a joke, only to watch the moment slide past her like she hadn't spoken at all. But here's where Meg's complexity often went unnoticed. She wasn't entirely bitter. She could laugh at herself, sometimes even harder than the others. She found small joys in unlikely places, a sarcastic comeback that actually landed. A rare moment when someone listened, even a shared eye roll with Brian when the chaos of the house hit a new peak. These little flashes of connection were enough to keep her tethered. What she didn't know then, what she couldn't fully see, was that this quiet endurance was shaping her into someone who could survive in almost any environment. She was learning adaptability without realizing it, finding ways to keep her identity intact even when others tried to define it for her. She was, in her own unassuming way, building kind of emotional armor that looked nothing like the loud defenses people expected. On weekends, when the weather was right, Meg would take her bike and just ride, no destination, no reason except to feel the wind in her face and the sense that she was moving forward, even if just for a while. Sometimes she'd pass streets she didn't know, houses with lights glowing warmly in the windows, and she'd wonder what it would be like to live in one of them. Not as a Griffin, not as the butt of every joke, but as someone whose presence mattered. It was in those moments of motion that she felt most like herself. Not the Meg that people saw, but the Meg who was quietly hopeful, stubbornly holding on to the belief that life could still open up in ways she hadn't imagined. The truth was, Meg's story wasn't just about enduring. It was about carrying a flicker of possibility through the dimmest corridors of her day-to-day life, keeping it alive until she found a place where it could burn brighter. That flicker, that quiet, stubborn light, would become more important than she could know, because the next chapter of her life, though she couldn't see it coming, would test that endurance in ways far beyond awkward school dances or family dinners gone wrong. It would ask her to decide, once and for all, whether she was going to stay in the shadows where people had placed her, or step into a space she had to carve out for herself. And somewhere deep down, even if she didn't dare say it yet, she already knew the answer. The years that followed were not kind to the Griffin household, and for Meg, they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Adolescence, with its storms and shifting sands, had arrived like an uninvited guest, upending the fragile stability she had worked so hard to protect. While other teenagers found refuge in friend groups, budding romances, and self-discovery, Meg's path was a strange and lonely one, an uphill climb through terrain littered with misunderstandings, cruel remarks, and moments that felt like they could shatter her for good. She moved through those days with a quiet resilience, though the cracks in her armor deepened each time someone reminded her of her perceived inadequacies. High school had been a crucible, where her identity was not something she could freely shape, but instead something handed to her by others. Nicknames, rumors, and relentless teasing followed her down the halls. It wasn't just classmates. It was a broader culture that had decided who Meg Griffin was before she could decide for herself. She learned to lower her gaze, to keep her laughter subdued, to shrink herself so as not to invite further scrutiny. And yet there was a small fire inside her that refused to go out. A tiny, stubborn spark that whispered, "You are more than this." At home, life was equally complicated. The family dynamic, already chaotic, seemed to shift with every passing year. Peter's antics grew bolder. Lois' patience stretched thinner, and Stewie, ever the calculating presence, often oscillated between strange affection and biting insult. Meg existed in the cross-currents of their personalities, sometimes overlooked, sometimes targeted, rarely understood. It was a strange place to grow up, one where love and mockery often came from the same mouth in the span of a single conversation. Still, there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, that reminded her of the warmth that could exist beneath the dysfunction. Late-night talks with Chris when the rest of the family was asleep, an unexpected word of encouragement from Lois, rare but cherished. Even Peter, in his clumsy and often misguided way, occasionally showed that he noticed her, that he cared in his own strange, unpredictable fashion. These moments never erased the hardships, but they planted seeds that would one day grow into something more, an understanding that connection often hides in the unlikeliest places. Outside the home, Meg found herself drawn to outlets that allowed her to exist without judgment. Sketching in the quiet corner of the library, writing in notebooks she never intended to show anyone, disappearing into the voices of her favorite bands. Music especially became a sanctuary. There was something about a song that could wrap itself around her thoughts, lifting her out of the fluorescent-lit classrooms and into a world where she was not defined by how others saw her. It was in those moments, headphones on, pen in hand, that she felt most herself, unobserved and unedited. Of course, the reality always came knocking. The ridicule never fully stopped, and the sense of being an outsider followed her like a shadow. But she learned to carry it differently. She started to recognize that the cruelty she faced often said more about others than it did about her. It wasn't an instant transformation, but a slow and steady reclaiming of the narrative she had been denied. She began speaking up more, not with the sharp-edged anger of someone trying to fight back, but with the calm defiance of someone who knew her worth even if others didn't. Her relationship with Lois during this time was complicated. On one hand, Lois was the person Meg most wanted approval from, the standard of poise and confidence she felt she could never reach. On the other, Lois's critiques could cut deeper than any schoolyard insult. Yet there were days when Lois surprised her, when she would offer advice, not as a mother scolding her daughter, but as a woman speaking to another woman about the difficulties of navigating life. Those rare exchanges stayed with Meg, even if they were few and far between. Peter, meanwhile, continued to be Peter, sometimes embarrassing, sometimes infuriating, but occasionally capable of moments of unexpected kindness. There was a peculiar comfort in his predictability, even if that predictability included wild schemes and absurd misadventures. Chris remained her closest ally, their sibling bond forged not out of similarity, but out of mutual understanding that in a family as chaotic as theirs, they needed each other more than they let on. As the years ticked on, Meg found herself in an interesting place. still figuring out who she was, still dealing with the noise of other people's opinions, but slowly starting to realize that her story was far from over. There were parts of herself she hadn't yet explored, dreams she hadn't dared to chase, and truths she hadn't spoken aloud. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel entirely threatening. It felt like a horizon worth walking toward. She didn't know exactly what would come next. College, perhaps. A job that allowed her to disappear into the background while she figured things out. Maybe even travel, though that felt like a far-off possibility. But she did know this. She had survived everything that had been thrown her way so far, and that counted for something. The quiet resilience she had built over the years was not a weakness. It was a foundation. And one day, when the right moment came, she would build something lasting on top of it. For now, she carried on. Some days heavier than others, some nights quieter than she liked. But she kept moving, one step at a time, with that stubborn spark still flickering inside her. And though she didn't yet know it, that spark would one day become a flame, one that could not be ignored no matter how hard the world tried. This was the in-between, the space where childhood had ended, but adulthood had yet to truly begin. And in that space, Meg Griffin was slowly, quietly, becoming someone worth knowing. Not the version people saw from the outside, but the real one. The one she was still learning to love. Stewie's world, for all its sharp edges and biting commentary, had always been framed by the strange contradictions of his own existence. On one hand, he was the hyper-intelligent mastermind, the would-be world conqueror who could build a time machine out of spare parts and pure spite. On the other, he was still a baby, subject to the whims of naps, bottles, and the soft, incomprehensible rhythm of a family that often forgot just how unusual he truly was. It's this tension between genius and infancy that fueled so much of his hidden inner life. To the outside world, his sarcasm and grandiose threats were the performance. Behind closed doors, though, the quieter, stranger thoughts had room to grow. It wasn't just about his plans to rewrite history or conquer the globe. It was about something far more personal, a search for connection, for recognition, for someone who truly saw him as more than the smallest member of the Griffin household. There were moments, fleeting, almost fragile, when that longing showed itself in ways that even Stewie didn't fully understand. The rare occasions when Brian actually listened to him without mockery. The strange comfort he took in Lois's absent-minded humming when she did laundry, even though she often dismissed him. These moments never lasted long, but they left impressions on him, like faint fingerprints on glass. It wasn't always easy for Stewie to process those feelings. Affection, for him, often arrived in disguise. It might manifest as an elaborate scheme to gain someone's attention, or as a sarcastic jab meant to test the strength of a bond. In some ways, his sharp tongue was a shield, an emotional firewall built to keep vulnerability at bay. Yet every now and then the shield cracked. Like the night he wandered into Brian's room under the guise of needing to inspect the dog's half-finished novel. He picked it up, pretended to scoff at its melodrama, then asked, almost casually, "Why do you write things you don't show anyone?" Brian had mumbled something about fear of judgment, and Stewie, without missing a beat, had replied, "I understand." It was a simple exchange, but it stayed with him for days afterward, nagging at him in ways no villainous plot ever could. This inner complexity made Stewie's emotional world difficult to map, even for himself. He could spend one morning plotting the demise of a playground rival, and that very afternoon secretly comforting Rupert after imagining the teddy bear was feeling underappreciated. To Stewie, Rupert wasn't just a toy. He was a silent witness to every plan, every heartbreak, every unspoken confession. The bear never judged him, never laughed, never forgot. In a strange way, Rupert was the truest friend he had, if only because he could never betray him. Still, even Rupert couldn't answer the questions that often kept Stewie awake. Why did the people he cared about so rarely seem to notice the depth of his thoughts? Why was his intelligence often met with laughter instead of awe? And perhaps most unsettling, why did the moments of genuine human connection feel so fleeting, like water slipping through his fingers? There was an evening just after dinner, when Stewie had perched himself in the living room armchair, legs dangling, quietly watching the rest of the family. And Peter was telling some ridiculous story about work. Lois was trying to keep him on track. Chris was halfway through a giant sandwich, and Meg was simply being ignored as usual. Stewie, for a brief moment, saw them not as the chaotic, dysfunctional mess they so often appeared to be, but as a unit, a collection of flawed people bound together by the strange gravity of family life. He wondered just for a second what it might feel like to truly belong in that unit, without needing to perform, without needing to prove himself. The thought unsettled him. Stewie didn't like to linger on vulnerability. It felt too much like weakness. So he shook it off, made a snide comment about Peter's story, and returned to the safety of his persona. But the thought lingered quietly in some corner of his mind. The truth was, Stewie's intelligence didn't protect him from loneliness. If anything, it amplified it. His ability to see through people's words, to dissect their motives, meant he was often aware of gaps and silences that others never noticed. He could tell when someone's laugh didn't reach their eyes, or when a compliment was laced with pity. And because of that, genuine sincerity was something he both craved and distrusted. This contradiction was at the core of his emotional lore. The genius who could build anything, yet couldn't quite build a space in the world where he felt fully understood. His darker impulses, the threats, the weapons, the dangerous inventions, were in some ways elaborate distractions from that ache. If he couldn't have connection, then at least he could have control. But life has a way of sneaking small, disarming moments into even the most fortified of hearts. Once on a rainy afternoon, Stewie had been in the backyard attempting to test a new weather control device. The experiment failed spectacularly, leaving him drenched and furious. He stomped inside, muttering about primitive atmospherics, when Lois appeared with a towel, wrapped it around him without a word, and ruffled his hair. She didn't laugh. She didn't lecture. She just noticed. And for reasons Stewie couldn't explain, that simple act hit him harder than any grand gesture could have. It was in moments like these, rare, unplanned, almost invisible, that the baby behind the genius showed himself. The Stewie who wasn't plotting or performing. The Stewie who, deep down, wanted to be loved without condition. And yet, as quickly as such moments came, they vanished. He would retreat back into his fortress of wit and ambition, determined not to let anyone see the cracks. After all, he had a reputation to maintain, and nothing said emotional liability like admitting you wanted a hug. But those cracks were there nonetheless, and as Stewie's story unfolded over the years, they would widen in ways he never anticipated, letting in both light and shadow. Because for all his talk of domination and destruction, his deepest battles were always fought in silence, inside the fragile space between who he was and who he let the world see. It was in the quiet pauses between the chaos that Stewie's mind found its most dangerous playground. The stillness was not peace. It was calculation, the slow simmer of thoughts that had been brewing for years. Every moment that passed without action was a moment in which his mind constructed new possibilities, each more intricate than the last. In the wake of the last series of events, the ones that had left him questioning the strength of his own convictions, Stewie found himself pacing the nursery in deliberate, measured steps, almost as if he could walk his way into understanding. The pale glow of the nightlight painted soft shapes along the walls, distorted by the faint sway of his movements. Outside, the Griffin household was still, but inside his head, it was anything but. He had just experienced an emotional confrontation with truths he had tried to bury. Truths about his own fears, about the way he viewed the people around him. The previous encounter had left him with an uncomfortable aftertaste. Not defeat, but vulnerability. And vulnerability was not something Stewie allowed himself to feel for long. His response was not to retreat, but to double down, to sharpen the edges of his own resolve. Yet somewhere beneath all that resolve was a tiny fracture, a hairline crack in the armor he had so carefully built. That fracture came from something he had no blueprint for, emotional connection. He hated the fact that his plans, his intelligence, his entire identity as a strategist could be rattled not by some elaborate counter-scheme, but by a moment of compassion, a word spoken without calculation, a fleeting gesture of warmth. It was infuriating, and it was dangerous because it made him feel human. And if he was human, then all the control he thought he had might just be an illusion. He sat down at the edge of his crib, pulling a soft blanket over his lap as if the act of covering himself could somehow anchor his thoughts. He traced the edge of the fabric with his fingers, an absent-minded motion that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered to darker places. The idea of control had always been his anchor. If he could manipulate the board, he could dictate the outcome. But what if the board itself was flawed? What if there were pieces in play he couldn't move, couldn't anticipate, because they were governed by emotions rather than logic? In the dim quiet, the air seemed to hum faintly with that question. The kind of hum that wasn't a sound but a presence, a reminder that something unresolved lingered just out of reach. Stewie leaned back against the crib's wooden bars, eyes scanning the ceiling as if it might offer him a clue. There was no one to talk to in these moments. Not Brian, not Lois, not anyone. Even the family dog who had seen him at his most open would never fully grasp the complexity of what was unfolding in his mind. But Stewie didn't need them to understand. He only needed himself. The days that followed blurred together in a strange rhythm. Morning routines passed without fanfare, Lois's voice calling from the kitchen, Peter bumbling into another minor catastrophe, Meg drifting silently in the background, Chris absorbed in his own world. Each moment played out like a loop he'd seen before, a predictable script that left plenty of mental space for him to work through the deeper questions. Yet he found himself watching them all more closely than usual, almost studying them as if they were test subjects. Every tone of voice, every expression, every small lapse in control told him something. It wasn't just observation, it was data gathering. And the more he collected, the more he realized how much of life was ruled by things beyond calculation. Peter's impulsive joy, Meg's quiet endurance, Lois's subtle frustrations. None of these were the products of strategy, yet they shaped outcomes in ways plans never could. That truth gnawed at him, because it meant his mastery of logic could never account for the full picture. Late one afternoon, as shadows stretched long across the living room, Stewie sat perched on the couch, clutching a juice box he hadn't touched. The TV was on, playing one of Peter's ridiculous shows, but Stewie wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on his mother, who was in the kitchen stirring something on the stove. There was a slight furrow between her brows. Not anger, not sadness, just the weight of something she wasn't saying. Stewie caught it instantly. He wondered how many such moments he'd missed in the past, too absorbed in his own schemes to notice the silent currents in the people around him. And for the briefest moment, he saw the fragility in it all, how easily the structures people built for themselves could shift, collapse, or be rebuilt entirely, not through force, but through the quiet influence of emotion. That realization didn't make him softer. If anything, it made him more determined. Because now he understood the other battlefield. It wasn't just about intellect. It was about emotional terrain and the subtle power it held. That night he sat by the window in his room, legs crossed, staring out at the street. The glow of the lamppost outside cut a narrow path through the darkness, and he followed it with his eyes until it disappeared into the edge of the neighborhood. His thoughts wandered to Brian, to Lois, to moments that had caught him off guard, not because they were strategically impressive, but because they bypassed strategy altogether. He realized then that emotional manipulation wasn't a lesser skill. In fact, it might be the most powerful one of all, precisely because it worked in the shadows of the conscious mind. The days ahead would not be defined by a single grand plan, but by a series of subtle moves, each planted carefully, almost invisibly, into the lives around him. He would learn this other language, the one built on tone and glance, on pauses and unspoken weight. If logic was the sword, emotion was the invisible thread pulling it toward its target, and Stewie, ever the student of conquest, had just found a new weapon to master. The night deepened, and for the first time in days he felt no pressing urgency to act. Instead, he let the awareness settle in him like a slow, steady flame, something that could burn quietly until the moment it was needed. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the house in a way that almost sounded like a whisper. Inside, Stewie closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in patience. Because if there was one thing he knew now, it was that some victories required waiting, not rushing. And in the silence, he could already feel the shape of the next move forming. It's strange the way silence sometimes feels louder than any broadcast. The way certain stories, even in a world as chaotic and shameless as Family Guy, remain in the shadows, never spoken of openly, but lingering in whispers between the writer's room and the studio walls. We've just walked through the unsettling corridors of what happens when characters' lives spiral behind closed doors, but now we tilt the lens towards something stranger. Not the moments we've seen, not the episodes we've dissected over and over again, but the ghosts of episodes that were never meant to meet the public eye. It's a peculiar concept, isn't it? In a series that's built its reputation on pushing boundaries, breaking rules, and dancing gleefully across the line of good taste, how could anything be too much? Yet the truth is, the world behind the animation cells isn't free from limits. There are scripts that sit buried in drawers, rough sketches that were quietly erased, and audio tracks recorded in full, but never paired with visuals. Sometimes the reasons are obvious: network politics, audience sensitivity, or legal tangles that even Quahog's absurdity couldn't untangle. Other times, the reasons are far murkier, almost conspiratorial. The first of these lost episodes isn't even a rumor. It's confirmed, in a way, by those who've worked on the show. A storyline so strange that it made it through the first round of table reads before vanishing without a trace. In it, the Griffins would have been drawn to a plot revolving around a mysterious box delivered to their doorstep. The entire episode would have been one long, drawn-out build-up to the reveal of its contents. No cutaway gags, no B-plot to break the tension, just the creeping unease of a family growing more paranoid with each passing day. In the final moments, the box would open, and the screen would cut to black. No answer, no punchline, just the credits rolling in silence. It's the kind of concept that sounds almost too subtle for Family Guy's usual energy, but those who've read the script say it was laced with undercurrents of unease, dark hints about the nature of the family itself. Too dark, perhaps, for the network's liking. According to one production assistant, it didn't feel like Family Guy. It felt like something that wanted to make you question why you ever laughed at them in the first place. That's the thing about episodes that never air. Sometimes it's not because they crossed the line, it's because they quietly rewrote what the line even was. Then there's the one known among staff by a working title, The Quahog Funeral. No one has ever confirmed whose funeral it was meant to be, though leaks from storyboard artists suggest it wasn't a side character or background extra. The outline hinted at one of the core cast members meeting an unceremonious, even uncomfortable end, played straight, without the usual reset button that so often revives the dead in animation. Viewers would have watched the Griffins grieve, not in melodramatic parodies, but in something eerily grounded. Word is, the network feared it would unbalance the show permanently, as if once that grief was real, the jokes would ring differently forever. We imagine these episodes as lost treasures, but they also carry an unsettling weight. The creatives involved don't speak of them lightly. One storyboarder in a rare late-night interview said it was like walking into a room you weren't supposed to find. There's dust and light coming through the cracks, and you can feel someone was there before you, but they left in a hurry. That imagery sticks with you, doesn't it? The idea that there's something tangible but unreachable, locked behind the network's invisible vault. Not all lost episodes are born from artistic ambition gone awry. Some were casualties of real-world events. There was, for instance, an episode that reportedly involved a massive citywide disaster in Quahog. The script was finished, the voice actors had recorded their parts, and the animatics were halfway complete. But just before its scheduled air date, a tragedy in the real world made the parallels far too close for comfort. The decision was made in hours. The episode was shelved indefinitely. Some say bits of it were repurposed in later seasons, chopped into cutaway gags and background nods, but the full version has never resurfaced. In the archives, it remains sealed, a strange sort of time capsule, frozen in a moment when fiction and reality collided too abruptly. And then there are the episodes that never even make it to the writing board because they only exist in whispers. Concepts pitched in the heat of late-night brainstorming that die before daylight can soften them. Ideas that skirt not just the edge of acceptability, but the edge of plausibility. A what-if episode where Stewie travels not through time, but into alternate versions of Family Guy itself, universes where the tone shifts entirely. One version, according to rumor, was animated in a style deliberately unsettling, with character designs distorted ever so slightly, making the familiar suddenly alien. These ideas don't just vanish. They linger in the DNA of the show, sometimes resurfacing as tiny references, a quick visual gag, or a one-off line of dialogue that feels different. Almost like the writers are testing the waters, wondering if they can smuggle a fragment of the forbidden into the broadcast. It's these moments, fleeting as they are, that make you wonder how much of Family Guy we've actually seen, and how much has been carefully tucked away. As the years went on, the notion of too far shifted. What might have been unairable in the early seasons could slip through in the later ones, while other concepts became riskier as cultural climates changed. In a way, the list of lost episodes is a mirror of the world outside Quahog, a reminder that satire doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a constant negotiation between pushing buttons and knowing when pressing them might set off something you can't laugh off. There's a kind of magic in that tension, though, because every time a story is locked away, it leaves space for our imaginations to run wild. And sometimes, what we imagine in that silence is far stranger than anything the writers could put on paper. These missing chapters in Family Guy's history are like shadows, defined not by what they show, but by what they hide. Stewie's voice, both literal and metaphorical, found its sharpest edges not only in moments of grand ambition, but also in the smallest exchanges with his family. In many ways, these moments were his secret laboratory, an ongoing series of trials in which he tested the limits of sarcasm, wit, and emotional manipulation. Sometimes it was as simple as correcting someone's grammar in the middle of a casual conversation, just to see if they would even notice. Other times it was weaponizing a moment of vulnerability from Lois or Brian to win an argument days later. These weren't acts of malice in his mind, but demonstrations, proof that words, when chosen with precision, could rival any weapon he might invent. It was during these exchanges that Stewie's developing comedic rhythm took shape. He was not a stand-up comedian in the traditional sense. Instead, his delivery relied on razor-thin timing, a balance between feigned innocence and blunt insult. He might pause just long enough for his target to think they were safe before delivering the verbal strike. He understood the importance of pacing, tone, and even body language, tilting his head slightly, lowering his voice, widening his eyes, to give each insult a performance quality. It was art disguised as cruelty, though it's possible even Stewie didn't fully realize how much of it came from a desire to connect rather than to destroy. The family, for their part, began to learn his patterns. Brian, with his own brand of wit, often parried Stewie's verbal jabs, turning their interactions into something like a chess match where each move was a joke, layered over a genuine insight. Lois, though occasionally caught off guard, began to see that Stewie's barbs often came at moments when the house felt chaotic, when he wanted someone, anyone, to match him on his intellectual and emotional wavelength. Even Peter, whose responses were usually far less calculated, sometimes stumbled into an unexpectedly sharp comeback that caught Stewie off guard. Those rare moments left Stewie quietly amused, as if finding an unlikely spark in an otherwise unpolished stone. This back-and-forth dynamic served as both playground and battleground for Stewie's personality. It gave him room to sharpen his instincts, but also forced him to confront something deeper, the idea that not every form of dominance came from control. Sometimes it came from allowing others to play their own game, to have their own voice. And in those moments, Stewie's carefully constructed image of himself as the sole master manipulator cracked just slightly, letting something warmer through. These little cracks became more frequent in times when the household felt united, which was rare but memorable. A family movie night, for example, would start predictably enough, with Stewie making snide remarks about the film's plot holes. But somewhere along the way, he'd find himself laughing not at the movie, but at Peter's unrestrained guffaws or Chris's oddly specific observations. It was as though the rhythms of conversation and shared experience temporarily quieted the more calculated parts of his mind, letting the simple enjoyment of the moment take over. He would never admit it outright, of course, But these were the moments he tucked away in his mental archives, resurfacing when the chaos of his own ambitions grew too loud. Outside the living room, Stewie's voice took on a different role entirely. With strangers, neighbors, or visitors, it often became sharper, more theatrical, almost like a persona he could step into and out of at will. He exaggerated his mannerisms, polished his vocabulary, and heightened his sarcasm, presenting a curated version of himself designed to both impress and intimidate. It was performance as a form of control. If he dictated how others perceived him, then he could avoid being caught off guard. This self-awareness extended to moments when he deliberately tested how far he could push people's perceptions. Sometimes he would play the charming, well-spoken prodigy, captivating his audience with eloquent observations. Other times, he would intentionally lean into his more eccentric tendencies, throwing out remarks so sharp or absurd that the other person was left unsure whether to laugh or retreat. Stewie thrived in that uncertainty. It gave him space to remain unpredictable, which in his mind was a form of power in itself. Yet unpredictability had its costs. Maintaining a carefully constructed persona meant constantly monitoring his own words, adjusting his tone, calculating the effect each statement would have. It was exhausting in ways Stewie rarely acknowledged. On certain days, when the house was unusually quiet and his energy low, he would let the mask slip. His voice would soften, his sentences grow shorter, and his vocabulary less performative. In those rare moments, he wasn't delivering a line or planning a punchline. He was simply speaking. And though he would likely bristle at the suggestion, those were often his most honest moments. One evening in particular stood out. The rain had been falling steadily since afternoon, tapping against the windows in a slow, unbroken rhythm. Brian had been reading on the couch while Stewie, curled in the armchair with a blanket, made an uncharacteristically gentle observation about the sound of the rain. It wasn't a joke, nor was it part of a larger point. It was just an observation. And instead of moving on, the two sat in that quiet, letting the sound fill the space between words. For Stewie, it was a reminder that silence didn't always have to be a void. It could be a shared experience, a kind of unspoken connection. But the quiet couldn't last forever. The following day, the house was back to its usual chaos. Peter loudly recounting an improbable work story, Lois trying to keep order, and Chris accidentally creating a mess in the kitchen. Stewie, slipping easily back into his sharper tone, made a remark so pointed that even Peter paused mid-sentence. The balance was restored, the performance resumed, yet something about the rain-soaked evening lingered in the back of his mind. Perhaps that was the paradox of Stewie Griffin's voice. It could cut as sharply as a blade, but it could also carry warmth, sometimes in the same breath. The constant interplay between these extremes shaped not only how others saw him, but how he saw himself. His evolution wasn't about replacing one with the other, but about learning when each was needed, when to wield the scalpel and when to offer the bomb. Over time, this awareness became more instinctive. In conversations that once might have ended with a dismissive quip, Stewie found himself occasionally offering a quieter, more thoughtful comment instead. Not always, and not predictably, he would never give up the joy of a perfectly timed insult, but enough to suggest that the sharp edges of his personality were no longer his only tools. And in that gradual shift, Stewie's voice became something richer than it had been before. It was still clever, still cutting, still entirely his own, but it now carried layers that allowed him to navigate not only the chaos of his family, but also the unpredictable rhythms of the wider world. His words could build as easily as they could dismantle, invite as readily as they could repel, In learning to balance those powers, he wasn't losing himself. He was, in his own way, expanding. Under the soft wash of moonlight over Quahog, Meg's world shifted again. And not with the drama of a major family blow-up or the absurdity of one of Peter's schemes, but with the quieter, more insidious force of subtle exclusion. It was in these understated moments, the ones without yelling or theatrics, that the deepest wounds seemed to take root. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, half scrolling through a social feed, half staring at the wall, her headphones resting loosely around her neck. The house was alive downstairs, laughter, muffled voices, the clink of glasses. They were having one of those unplanned Griffin mini-parties that just sort of happened when Peter invited a few friends, and somehow the living room filled with people. Meg hadn't been told. She wasn't even sure if she was welcome. This kind of scene had played out before. The rest of the family integrated effortlessly into the noise and chaos, while Meg found herself upstairs listening to the party through floorboards, as though the wood itself carried the sound just for her. The strange thing was, she didn't even want to be downstairs most of the time. But not wanting to be somewhere and not being included in the first place were two very different things. One was choice, the other was a reminder. She got up eventually, not because she planned to join in, but because she was thirsty. The hallway felt colder than her room, as though the hum of conversation downstairs sucked the warmth from the air. She padded to the top of the stairs and paused. From here, she could see the backs of heads, the shifting glow of the TV, and Peter standing near the kitchen with a beer in one hand, animatedly telling some story that made the whole room roar with laughter. Lois was there too, smiling politely, filling plates with snacks for people Meg didn't recognize. Chris was in the middle of it all, laughing along, while Stewie darted between legs, clearly up to something mischievous. Meg descended slowly, each step a choice, half hoping someone would notice her, half bracing herself for the possibility that no one would. And predictably, when she reached the bottom, she didn't become part of the scene so much as she became a piece of furniture in it. She passed through the room quietly, not interrupting any conversations, heading for the kitchen to get her a glass of water. No one stopped her, and that was almost worse than if someone had told her outright to leave. The party carried on without a hitch. She lingered for a moment at the sink, pretending to rinse her glass longer than necessary just to be near the sound of people. It was a strange comfort, like being close to a campfire, but never warm enough to lose the chill in your bones. She caught snippets of conversation. Stories about jobs she didn't know these people had, jokes she didn't have the context for, mentions of nights out she'd never been invited to. She thought about speaking up, maybe making some small joke or contributing something, but the timing never felt right. It was like trying to merge onto a busy highway without an opening. By the time she worked up the nerve, the moment had passed. When she finally retreated back upstairs, the glass of water in hand felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just liquid. It was the weight of that reminder, the one that always came back, no matter how much she tried to ignore it. There was a kind of belonging in this house, but it wasn't meant for her. She sat back on her bed, the thump of bass from downstairs faint through her walls, and opened her laptop. If her real-world environment didn't have a place for her, the digital one at least offered the illusion of connection. Online, she could choose her spaces. She could enter a chat where her name was recognized, where her input sparked responses, where she didn't feel like she was speaking into a void, and tonight, that mattered. But the night wasn't all about withdrawal. Somewhere between browsing playlists and sending a few idle messages, Meg decided she wouldn't just let herself fade into the background. She pulled up a notepad file where she'd been keeping fragments of thoughts, half-written posts, jokes, and little pieces of self-expression she never quite found the nerve to share. Some were sharp, sarcastic jabs at her life in Quahog. Others were more vulnerable, like small windows into the kind of person no one in her house seemed to see. Tonight she started typing again, letting the words come in their unfiltered form, telling herself she could decide later whether they ever saw daylight. This small act, in its own way, was rebellion. Not the loud, reckless kind Peter specialized in, but the quiet, stubborn insistence on existing fully, even if no one around her was paying attention. Writing gave her that sense of control that the rest of the evening had denied her. It was her way of stitching herself into a narrative, even if it was only on her own terms. Hours passed like this, the distant laughter downstairs eventually fading as the party wound down. She heard the front door open and close multiple times, voices becoming softer until they were gone altogether. Then came the creak of the stairs as her family made their way to bed. She didn't move when Lois peeked into her room, offering a brief, almost distracted good night before moving on. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't the warmth Meg had been quietly craving all night either. When the house finally settled into silence, Meg closed her laptop and set it aside. The moonlight that had been faint earlier now poured more freely into her room, illuminating her desk, her posters, the stack of clothes she kept meaning to fold. She lay back, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the invisible thread that seemed to run through her life, connecting moments like tonight into a bigger pattern. It wasn't always painful, but it was always present. And as sleep began to pull her under, she wondered if maybe the quiet defiance of documenting it all would one day be enough to change something, even if no one else noticed. Tomorrow, the cycle would probably start again. But tonight, she had her words. And for now, that was enough. Under the heavy veil of night in Quahog, the streets took on that familiar, quiet hum. A town sleeping, but never truly still. In the Griffin household, the stillness was deceptive. Behind Meg's closed bedroom door, a new kind of tension had begun to take shape, one that didn't come from an argument at dinner or a cruel comment from the hallway. It came from her own thoughts, those restless, circling patterns that refused to let her sink into sleep. Her lamp was on, casting a pale circle of light across the desk where an open notebook lay waiting. The page was blank except for a single sentence written in hurried, slanted handwriting. They think I'm invisible, but invisibility is just another kind of armor. She sat back in her chair, staring at the line. Part of her felt strange writing that down, as if admitting she chose to disappear from the family's radar might undo the quiet safety she'd built. But another part of her knew it was the truth. She'd been stepping back for years, making herself smaller in their world so she could explore the bigger one inside her own head. Downstairs, the faint sound of the TV bled through the floor. Peter's laugh, loud, unfiltered, broke into the quiet. It wasn't directed at her. It never was. That was the point. Meg realized she could sit here, unnoticed for hours, and nobody would think to check. Tonight, though, that isolation felt like an opportunity rather than a punishment. She reached for her pen again. She started writing about the last time she had actually spoken her mind at the dinner table. She'd been younger, maybe 14, and she had tried to explain why she wanted to join the school's photography club instead of the cheer squad. Peter had mocked her, Lois had brushed it off, and Chris had made a joke that got a laugh. Meg remembered how quickly she'd shut down after that, pushing her plate away and pretending she had homework. That moment had been one of the first times she'd felt the sting of realizing her voice could be drowned out so easily. Now, years later, she wasn't trying to get them to listen anymore. She was trying to make sure her voice carried somewhere else, maybe to the page, maybe to people who actually cared. The pen moved faster now, sketching out pieces of conversations she wished she could have. Imaginary dinners where someone asked her opinion and waited for the answer. Versions of the Griffin family where she wasn't the punchline. The words poured out, not perfectly, but honestly. And that felt like enough for tonight. Meanwhile, in the living room, the show on TV ended, and Lois stood up to turn off the lamp. She glanced toward the stairs, her expression unreadable for a moment. There was the faintest hint of awareness. Maybe she'd noticed Meg hadn't been around much lately, but it passed quickly. She switched off the light and went upstairs, footsteps muffled on the carpet. Meg heard her pass by the bedroom door and hesitated, half expecting a knock. None came. The sound of Lois's door closing was soft but final, like the last chapter of a book. Meg exhaled and kept writing. She realized that her notebooks had become the safest place she could speak freely. A secret archive of all the things she couldn't say out loud. The clock read 1:14 a.m. when she finally capped the pen. Her hand ached. Her eyes felt heavy. But there was a strange comfort in knowing that the world she'd built on paper would still be there in the morning. She turned off the desk lamp, the room falling into darkness except for the glow of the moon through the blinds. In the silence, her thoughts began to slow, and for once, she felt the weight of them lift just enough to sleep. The next day was one of those bright, slightly too warm mornings where Quahog seemed to hum with an odd energy. Meg slipped out early, taking the long way to school just to avoid running into anyone in the kitchen. She carried her notebook in her backpack, tucked between textbooks, almost like a talisman. At school, the day passed in its usual rhythm. Classes she half listened to. Conversations she drifted around instead of into. But something had shifted. During lunch, instead of eating in the corner, she sat outside near the back steps of the gym, where the sun hit the brick wall in a way that made it feel like her own small territory. She pulled out the notebook and kept writing. She didn't notice at first that someone else had sat nearby, a girl from her English class, quiet in her own way, sketching in a worn sketchbook. They didn't talk, not really, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement in the air. Neither of them belonged to the cafeteria crowd, but here, in this little slice of sun and silence, it didn't matter. When the bell rang, Meg put the notebook away, but the thought stayed with her. Maybe invisibility wasn't the same as being alone. Later that afternoon, as she walked home, she thought about how her family would be exactly the same when she walked in. Peter probably in front of the TV, Lois on the phone, Chris gaming, Stewie plotting something in the corner of his mind. Nothing would be different in their world. But hers was slowly changing, one page at a time. By the time she reached the front steps, she had already decided she'd write again tonight. Maybe she'd even write about the girl with the sketchbook. After all, stories were better when they had more than one voice, and Meg was starting to think she might have found someone who understood what it meant to speak quietly but with meaning. And as the door closed behind her, sealing her back into the familiar chaos of the Griffin household, Meg realized that for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was disappearing. She felt like she was preparing, slowly, quietly, for the moment she would finally be seen. The night had a way of softening even the sharpest of truths in Quahog. Lights from passing cars flickered against the walls of the Griffin household, casting brief, darting shadows that seemed to whisper their own little secrets before fading away. Behind those walls, life was still moving forward. Dinners eaten, shows watched, dishes washed. Yet underneath it all was the quiet thrum of change, a rhythm not everyone could hear, but one that was unmistakably there. For the Griffins, And especially for the unseen corners of their family dynamic, this was a chapter defined not by loud confrontations, but by the subtle rearranging of connections behind closed doors. Chris, in his room, was sketching again. The paper beneath his pencil was filling with exaggerated shapes. His art often leaned toward the absurd, though tonight there was a certain warmth to it. These weren't just doodles. They were small pieces of his inner world. He had always been easy to dismiss as the simple Griffin, the one who lived in the shadow of sharper personalities. But inside that mind of his was a kind of sincerity that rarely found a stage in the family's daily chaos. Each curve of the pencil was a little act of defiance against being underestimated, a quiet claim to a piece of himself that nobody could quite take away. Downstairs, Meg sat curled on the couch, knees tucked beneath her chin, flicking through channels without really watching any of them. The room smelled faintly of the tea she had made earlier, though it had gone cold on the coffee table beside her. She was thinking, though she wouldn't have said it out loud, about the way small acts could speak louder than grand gestures. The kind of things you notice only if you're paying close attention. The way someone hands you something without looking at you, or how they linger just a second too long in the doorway before leaving. She had learned that in this house, those quiet signals carried more truth than most words spoken at full volume. Peter wandered in, half distracted by a bag of chips he was eating straight from the bag. His presence shifted the air as it always did. He had a way of making the room feel like it belonged to him simply by being in it. Without looking at Meg, he dropped a passing remark about something he'd seen on TV earlier, a ridiculous infomercial for a gadget that, in true Peter fashion, he thought was life-changing. Meg barely looked up, but her lips twitched with the smallest hint of a smile. Moments like these weren't about the content of the conversation, but about the simple reminder that they were still a family, still orbiting one another, no matter how far apart their personal planets sometimes drifted. And upstairs, Lois stood by the window in her bedroom, gazing out into the quiet street below. The curtain in her hand fluttered slightly from the breeze seeping through the frame. She wasn't thinking about the errands she had to run tomorrow or the endless list of things that kept the house functioning. Instead, her mind was lingering on the invisible threads that tied her to each member of her family. The bonds that could stretch, tangle, and even fray but never fully snap. She had seen them through so many storms, both spoken and silent, and she knew that their ability to endure wasn't about perfection. It was about the way they kept showing up for each other, even when they didn't have the words to explain why. The Griffins didn't do heart-to-heart in the traditional sense. They rarely sat down for emotional declarations or shared life lessons without at least a little sarcasm to blunt the edges. But every now and then those barriers cracked in subtle ways. A forgotten chore quietly done for someone else. A late-night snack brought without being asked. An awkward but genuine attempt to listen. The magic of these moments was that they didn't require acknowledgement. They simply became part of the unspoken ledger of care that existed in the background of their lives. Brian, lounging on the armchair with a half-finished glass of wine, noticed these things more than most. Perhaps it was his tendency to observe rather than participate. Or maybe it was the peculiar position he held in the family. Not quite a pet, not quite a human, but something in between. He caught the glance Meg gave Peter after his rambling, chip-fueled commentary. He noticed the way Chris, when he came downstairs to grab a snack, subtly set the TV remote within Meg's reach before heading back upstairs. He even caught Lois glancing down the hall before turning off the kitchen light, as if making sure everyone was where they were supposed to be. And Stewie. Well, Stewie noticed too, though he'd never admit it. From the vantage point of the stairs, he occasionally paused to study them all, as though cataloging data for some elaborate experiment. To him, family was both a source of endless frustration and an irreplaceable constant. And though his affections were often buried under layers of wit and superiority, he absorbed these quiet exchanges like a scientist noting rare phenomena. It wasn't sentimentality, of course, not in his words, but somewhere deep inside he knew these were the ties that tethered him to this house, to these people, and to this strange, unpredictable life. The evening wore on. Conversations ebbed and flowed, sometimes as trivial as debating the best way to reheat pizza, other times dipping into moments of unintentional vulnerability. A soft rain began to patter against the windows, its rhythm blending with the low hum of the television and the occasional creak of the house settling. This was the kind of night where nothing grand happened, yet the weight of it lingered far longer than the more dramatic days. In this quiet, each member of the Griffin family was writing their own page in the unwritten book of who they were together. They were not a perfect family, far from it, but there was a strange beauty in the way they held each other in their own imperfect orbit. The unspoken rules and silent offerings stitched them together in ways that even they didn't always understand. And maybe that was the point. Some bonds don't need to be fully understood. They just need to be lived. When the rain finally began to ease, the house felt a little warmer, as if the storm had drawn them closer without their realizing it. Chris returned to his sketching. Meg found herself actually watching the show she had been ignoring. Peter fell asleep in his chair with the chip bag still in his lap, and Lois quietly pulled the blanket from the back of the couch to drape over him. No words were exchanged, no dramatic music swelled, just the steady hum of life continuing, moment by moment, behind closed doors. And somewhere in the shadows of that living room, in the way the air felt softer and the night seemed just a little less cold, you could sense it. That strange, enduring thing that kept them all here under the same roof, whether they could name it or not. Under the soft, muted tones of Quahog's ever-familiar backdrop, the pieces of the family's darker puzzles seemed to have aligned into something both mesmerizing and quietly unsettling. Meg's journey was never a single, clean line. It was a web, one where every thread connected to another in ways you wouldn't always notice until you traced it with a careful hand. And now, standing in the quiet, metaphorical center of that web, you could feel the tension of every strand, pulling from all directions, each humming with the echoes of past choices and lingering consequences. She had learned to survive by balancing contradictions, an overlooked girl who quietly burned with ambition, a target of ridicule who also mastered the art of invisibility. And when you look closely enough, that invisibility was almost weaponized. It allowed her to move through the cracks of family chaos, collecting little shards of truth that nobody else cared enough to notice. Meg didn't just watch, she remembered, she cataloged, and sometimes she acted, not out of malice, but out of a growing understanding that knowledge was power, even if you weren't yet sure how to use it. One such moment had happened during a winter when the Griffin household was weighed down with unspoken tension. Peter had been distracted for weeks, Lois had been strangely withdrawn, and Chris was spending more time away from home than in it. Meg, invisible as ever, noticed everything. Peter's phone calls taken in the garage late at night, Lois's careful avoidance of those conversations, and Chris's nervous glances during dinner. She didn't ask questions because she knew they wouldn't answer, but she began piecing together small clues, a receipt left on the counter here, a snippet of conversation overheard there. It painted a picture not of a single dramatic secret, but of a family quietly fraying at the edges, each member pretending not to see it happening. Meg's role in moments like this wasn't to intervene, at least not directly. Instead, she learned to carry these quiet truths like pebbles in her pocket, weighing her down just enough to remind her that she was part of this family, whether they acknowledged her or not. And maybe, just maybe, there would come a time when those pebbles could be tipped out and used as stepping stones towards something she wanted. But survival for Meg was never just about waiting. It was about carving little pockets of freedom for herself in a house that often felt like a cage. She found one such pocket in an old dust-covered attic space above the garage. Nobody ever went up there. And when she stumbled across it one rainy afternoon, it was like stepping into a secret room in her own life. She dragged up a few worn blankets, a lamp with a flickering bulb, and some old boxes she could use as makeshift shelves. In that cramped, slanted-ceiling space, she built something entirely her own, a small sanctuary where she could read, write, or just exist without the constant background noise of family chaos. In that attic, she kept a notebook. Not a diary. Meg didn't care to chronicle the blow-by-blow of her life, but a record of moments, observations, and the strange patterns she noticed in the people around her. Some pages were filled with sketches of her mother's expressions during arguments. Others had flowcharts of Peter's moods, scribbled out like she was mapping some unpredictable weather pattern. She didn't know if it was art, analysis, or just a way to keep herself sane. But in those pages, she was more than just Meg. She was the archivist of a family that didn't realize it was telling a story worth preserving. That's the thing about growing up in a place where you're consistently underestimated. You either shrink into the role they've written for you, or you quietly sharpen yourself in the shadows, waiting for the day they notice they've misjudged you. Meg wasn't sure yet which path she was walking, but she could feel the slow shift in herself, like a tide changing direction under a still surface. Her attic refuge also became a place where she allowed herself to imagine alternate versions of her life, worlds where she was not the punchline, where her voice carried weight, and where she wasn't constantly second-guessing her worth. Sometimes she imagined moving away from Quahog entirely, building a life in a city where nobody knew the Griffin name, where her past couldn't trail behind her like an unwanted shadow. Other times, she imagined a future where she stayed but rewrote the rules, taking control of the family dynamic in ways they'd never see coming. What she didn't know then was that both possibilities, escape and transformation, would remain in constant tension throughout her life. She would never entirely give up on the idea of leaving, but she would also never stop finding small ways to shift the ground beneath the people who thought they knew her best. The attic wasn't her only hiding place, of course. Sometimes she found sanctuary in unexpected places. The far corner of the public library, the quiet park bench near the duck pond, even the booth in the back of a nearly empty diner late at night. These were places where she could breathe without feeling like someone was watching her for a punchline. Places where she could watch other people and wonder about their hidden lives. Did they too carry secret notebooks in their minds? Did they have rooms in their houses they claimed as their own? There was a night when she sat in that diner sipping a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, and overheard two strangers talking in hushed voices about something they clearly didn't want the world to know. She didn't catch every word, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, protective, threaded with the kind of fear you only have when you've crossed the line you can't uncross. Meg didn't know what they'd done, and she didn't try to find out, but she recognized the feeling in their voices. It was the same feeling that sometimes hummed under the surface of her own family's life. Secrets weren't always malicious. They were sometimes just survival mechanisms in disguise. It was moments like these, quiet and seemingly insignificant, that made Meg feel connected to something larger than herself. She wasn't the only one navigating a life of silent compromises and unspoken truths. Maybe everyone was doing it, just in different ways, in different rooms, in different towns. And so the invisible girl carried on, not fading away entirely, but not stepping into the spotlight either. She stayed in that in-between space, where she could watch and listen and gather, shaping herself in ways that no one else could see. The attic light would keep flickering, the notebook would keep filling, and the web she'd been quietly weaving for years would keep stretching outward, one silken thread at a time. The story of Meg Griffin was never meant to be told in loud, dramatic bursts. It was meant to unfold slowly, like a secret you only discover if you're patient enough to notice it. And in that patience, in that careful tending of the quiet, Meg was becoming something far more interesting than the version of her everyone thought they knew. She was becoming the author of her own shadows, and eventually, she might just decide to let the rest of the world read them. It was almost uncanny how the quiet moments in the Griffin household could feel heavier than the loud ones. After the tangled web of family tension, whispers of unspoken secrets, and strange undercurrents that had been flowing through the house in recent weeks, the silence seemed more suspicious than the noise. Meg noticed it first, not because she was trying to, but because she was always scanning the room, the mood, the way people looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. The house didn't hum with the same lazy sitcom warmth it usually tried to fake. Instead, it felt staged, like everyone was tiptoeing around something they didn't want to knock over. The morning sun spilled across the kitchen table, catching Lois mid-sip of her coffee. Her expression was serene enough to pass for normal, but her eyes lingered on Meg a little too long before darting back to the newspaper. It was the kind of glance that Meg had learned to file away. Maybe it meant nothing, but maybe it was one of those moments you only understood much later. Peter, on the other hand, was doing his best to keep up his usual bumbling charm, humming some nonsense tune as he shuffled through the fridge. Yet even he seemed oddly aware of the quiet, as though the usual noise was missing a keynote. Stewie, strapped into his high chair, wasn't even mocking anyone this morning. He just watched, like he was recording the scene in his mind, piecing it together for later. Meg kept her eyes down, stirring her cereal, pretending to scroll through her phone. But in her chest, that restless little itch was back. It was the same one she felt whenever the family's mood shifted, when unspoken words filled the air thicker than steam from Lois's coffee. It wasn't that she expected anything good to come from asking questions. She'd learned long ago that pressing for answers in this house rarely brought clarity. But she couldn't help noticing the patterns. She'd been noticing them her whole life. It was in moments like these that Meg felt most aware of how much her family operated in layers. On the surface, goofy, dysfunctional, and endlessly willing to move on from chaos without ever really unpacking it. Beneath that surface, subtle exchanges, calculated silences, and the occasional flicker of something deeper, fear, resentment, or maybe even shame. The family could laugh through anything, but they didn't forget. They just buried it until the next odd ripple disturbed the surface again. Brian wandered into the kitchen, still smelling faintly of last night's whiskey, his fur a little messier than usual. He mumbled a half-hearted morning and immediately reached for the coffee pot, ignoring Meg entirely. She noticed how Lois gave him the same brief glance she'd given her earlier, quick, assessing, then gone. The room seemed to hold its breath until Brian settled into a chair, eyes fixed on nothing, as though he too had decided it was safer to pretend everything was fine. Meg found herself wondering if anyone else could feel it. The sense that something was being kept just out of reach, locked away behind tight smiles and casual chatter. She wanted to think it was just her imagination, maybe even her own paranoia feeding on scraps. But then Stewie, without looking up, muttered under his breath in that clipped British tone of his, "Ah, the domestic charade continues. Someone really should write this down." He didn't elaborate, and no one asked him to. The day moved on the way it always did, everyone scattering to their separate routines, leaving the house quieter than Meg liked. She found herself lingering in the living room, half watching a rerun of a show she didn't care about, half replaying the morning's odd stillness. It wasn't a single moment that bothered her, but the cumulative weight of all of them. Every little look, every awkward pause, every time someone chose silence instead of a real answer. When the front door creaked open that afternoon, Meg didn't expect it to be Peter. He usually didn't come home this early, and he rarely looked as serious as he did now. He froze when he saw her, like he'd walked into a room he thought would be empty. For a second, neither of them said anything. Then Peter forced a smile, too wide, too quick. "Hey, you seen your mom?" he asked. "She's upstairs," Meg said, watching him closely. Peter nodded, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Cool, just cool." He moved toward the stairs, but she noticed he didn't meet her eyes again. Whatever he was carrying, emotionally or otherwise, it wasn't something he wanted to share. Meg stayed on the couch, pretending not to care, but she could hear the muffled sound of Peter and Lois talking upstairs. She couldn't make out the words, but she could tell from the rhythm of their voices that it wasn't a casual conversation. There was an urgency to it, the kind of hushed intensity that made her wonder if she'd just witnessed the start of another secret the family would never explain. By the time they came back down, Lois's expression was unreadable, and Peter was already slipping into his usual goofy banter as if nothing had happened. But Meg saw the way Lois's hand lingered on Peter's arm for a fraction of a second too long, like she was grounding him, or maybe herself. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But she had a feeling it would come back around, the way these things always did. And that night, the quiet returned, stretching over dinner like a too-thick blanket. The conversation was disjointed, everyone talking just enough to avoid admitting they weren't really saying anything. Meg found herself zoning out, her gaze drifting to Stewie, who was watching the room like a chessboard. He caught her looking and gave her the faintest smirk, as though they were in on the same secret. Or maybe he was just amused that she noticed anything at all. Later, lying in bed, Meg thought about that smirk, about the morning silence, about the muffled conversation upstairs. She didn't know what any of it meant, but she knew one thing. Nothing in this family ever stayed buried forever. Sooner or later, whatever was hanging in the air now would find its way to the surface. And when it did, she wasn't sure if she'd be ready for it, or if anyone would. As the days blurred into a gentle haze, Meg's story pressed forward, tethered to the same thread we'd been following, a delicate weave of her yearning for identity, belonging, and something just a touch more than what life seemed ready to hand her. We had watched her fumble through the corridors of adolescence and claw her way toward something resembling individuality, only to see her dreams met with the quiet indifference of a world too busy to notice. And yet, there was always this strange resilience in her, a stubborn ember that refused to go cold, even when it seemed every gust of misfortune was trying to blow it out. In the stretch of her journey, the years seemed to take on a different weight. Her life no longer revolved solely around the cruel microcosm of high school, the petty rivalries, and the hallways echoing with laughter not meant for her. Now she began confronting the unsettling truth that the real world wasn't necessarily kinder. It was just bigger, more indifferent. Her attempts to fit in shifted into attempts to stand out, and though they rarely landed the way she hoped, they began carving out a sense of self that was no longer dictated entirely by others. She tried new identities on, like, thrift store jackets, sometimes keeping them for weeks, sometimes discarding them after a day. One week she was the indie music aficionado, lost in bands nobody else had heard of. The next, she was immersed in volunteer work, finding a strange comfort in helping people who never seemed to judge her. Through each reinvention, there was always that quiet hope that one of these roles might be the one to finally click. That moment when she wouldn't be Meg as the world saw her, but Meg as she defined herself. Still, in the spaces between these phases, the loneliness lingered. It wasn't always crushing. It could be gentle, almost comforting, but it was ever present. A reminder that no matter how many masks she wore, she was still searching for the one face that felt like home. That search bled into her relationships, or rather, her attempts at them. Some were fleeting crushes, others messy, drawn-out entanglements, where she mistook any form of attention for something deeper. These connections, more often than not, ended quietly, leaving her staring at her phone at 2 a.m., wondering if she had asked for too much or simply been too easy to forget. But it wasn't all loss and longing. Every so often, there were small victories. A compliment from someone she admired, a project that actually turned out the way she'd envisioned, a rare evening where she could look in the mirror and think, maybe I'm doing okay. These moments didn't erase the harder ones, but they stitched themselves into her memory as proof that life could, on occasion, bend in her favor. Her family, for all their chaos, remained both her tether and her undoing. Peter's carelessness, Lois's divided attention, Chris's own struggles, they all shaped her in ways she couldn't fully untangle. Sometimes they made her feel invisible. Other times they reminded her that invisibility wasn't the same as irrelevance. Even Stewie, with his sarcastic barbs and absurd inventions, offered her a strange sort of companionship, as if he recognized in her a fellow outsider navigating a world that didn't quite make sense. And through it all, Quahog itself seemed to shift around her. Familiar streets, changing storefronts, faces coming and going, seasons rolling past without asking her permission. The town was both cage and comfort, a place she swore she'd leave one day, even if she couldn't quite picture where she'd go. The more she grew, the more she began to realize that the breakthrough she'd been waiting for wasn't likely to arrive in one grand moment. It would come, if it came at all, in smaller, quieter shifts, like the way she'd started to speak up just a little more, or how she'd begun saying no to things she didn't want instead of nodding along out of habit. The world still didn't revolve around her, but it no longer spun on an axis that completely ignored her existence. Yet there was an undercurrent she couldn't shake, a pull toward something undefined, a sense that she was on the cusp of a chapter she didn't yet understand. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was more like the feeling before a storm, when the air changes and you know something's about to happen, even if you can't say what. And maybe that was the thread that had been running through her life all along, the quiet, stubborn belief that her story wasn't done unfolding, that the best, or the worst, was still somewhere ahead, waiting for her to stumble into it. For now, she kept moving, kept experimenting, kept holding on to the idea that one day all the scattered versions of herself might come together into something whole. And maybe, just maybe, when that day came, she'd be able to look around and see that the world had been holding a place for her all along, She just had to find her way to it. And in the background of all this, her world was about to throw her a curve she hadn't seen coming. Not a dramatic explosion or a sweeping romance, but something quieter, an encounter, a choice, a small shift that would end up tilting the course of her life in ways she wouldn't recognize until much later. For now, though, she was still just Meg, searching, stumbling, and in her own quiet way, refusing to fade away. If you want, I can flow straight into the next 1,000 words. So Chapter 4, Segment 1 is fully complete without a break. That way the pacing stays intact. Under the soft, muted glow of an imagined moon that seemed to hang over Quahog like an ever-watchful eye, the thread of Meg's story began to pull us deeper. The first segment had eased us into her more vulnerable and unseen side, peeling away the familiar layers of the clumsy, oft-ignored teenager, revealing someone who felt, thought, and remembered far more than her outward portrayal ever let on. But now, we move into a territory that feels even more intimate, a place where her resilience doesn't just emerge as a reaction to the ridicule, but as a deliberate act of quiet defiance. It's here that Meg begins to take shape, not just as the product of her environment, but as a creator of her own narrative, even if the pages are scribbled in pencil rather than ink. Meg's life, for much of its span, had been a story other people told for her. Her classmates narrated it in whispers and cruel laughter. Her family, consciously or not, annotated it with sarcasm and dismissive gestures. Even Quahog itself seemed to fold her into the role of background character, as though her presence was just a decorative element in the town's ongoing chaos. But this chapter of her journey begins with a subtle, almost invisible shift. One she doesn't announce, one she doesn't need permission for. She starts, slowly but surely, writing her own script. It began in small, almost unremarkable ways. A different way of walking down the school hallway, not faster to avoid stares, not slower to invite them, but steady with a rhythm that belonged to her. The quiet realization that she didn't have to shrink her voice in conversations. The way she started choosing clothes, not for approval, but because they felt right when she looked in the mirror. It wasn't about rebellion in the loud, cinematic sense. Meg didn't slam doors or stand on cafeteria tables to proclaim her independence. No, hers was a rebellion of quiet consistency, a refusal to remain the invisible background noise she'd been cast as. These shifts weren't entirely conscious at first. They came from exhaustion, the fatigue of constantly trying to dodge humiliation, of preemptively editing herself so she wouldn't become the punchline. Somewhere in that fatigue, she realized that playing the part others had given her was a kind of self-betrayal, and slowly, she stopped performing. If others noticed, they rarely said so, but in the still moments of her own mind, Meg felt it. One of the turning points came unexpectedly, as turning points so often do. It was after a particularly draining day, when the constant hum of mockery at school had felt heavier than usual. Meg had gone to the local library, one of the few places in Quahog where the air seemed to stay still, where nobody shouted across the room or turned everything into a spectacle. She wasn't there for homework or even to read. She was there to be surrounded by the quiet weight of shelves stacked with other people's thoughts. That's when she stumbled on a small, somewhat forgotten section at the back. It wasn't the self-help aisle, but something stranger journals, memoirs, personal essays from people whose lives had never made headlines, stories of people who had been dismissed, ignored, or underestimated, yet had still written about themselves as though their perspective mattered. Meg found herself sitting cross-legged on the floor, flipping through pages that felt almost conspiratorial reminders that existence, even if unremarkable to the outside world, still deserved to be recorded. She checked out a few of those books, though she didn't tell anyone about them. And that night, lying on her bed under the same glow-in-the-dark stars she'd stuck to her ceiling years ago, she opened a blank notebook and began to write. She didn't know what it would be, a diary, a memoir, random thoughts, and she didn't care. It was for her, and in a life where so much of her identity had been shaped by others, this small act felt monumental. Her entries were fragmented at first, half-formed thoughts, lines that trailed off mid-sentence. But over time, her writing became more deliberate, not because she was trying to make it perfect, but because she was learning to listen to herself. She wrote about the absurdity of her family, about the moments of kindness she noticed in strangers, about the quiet envy she felt toward people who seemed effortlessly confident. She even wrote about herself in the third person sometimes, as though she were crafting a character, a fictional girl named Meg, whose life bore suspicious resemblance to her own, but who, in these pages, had agency. And perhaps the most surprising thing was that the more she wrote, the less she cared about how others might perceive her. It wasn't that she became immune to ridicule. The sting was still there, but it lost some of its power. When you start telling your own story, the noise of others begins to fade. This inner shift began to spill into her daily life. At school, she no longer sought the safety of invisibility. She started answering questions in class more often, even when she wasn't completely sure of the answer. She spoke up when a teacher overlooked her raised hand. She volunteered for things she would have once avoided, like reading aloud. Sometimes these actions drew unwanted attention. Sometimes they drew nothing at all. But to Meg, every moment of showing up was another word in the story she was writing for herself. Her family, for the most part, didn't notice the transformation in the way she might have hoped. Peter still made his careless remarks. Lois was still distracted with the whirlwind of running the household. Chris remained in his own world, and Stewie was still Stewie. But there were tiny moments, barely perceptible, where something in the air shifted. Maybe Lois would ask about her day and actually pause to hear the answer. Maybe Chris would pass her the remote without argument. Maybe Stewie's insults were delivered with less bite, almost as though he'd noticed her presence as more than just an easy target. Meg didn't cling to these moments, but she noticed them. And in a strange way, she realized she no longer needed validation from them as much as she once did. Their approval was nice when it came, but it wasn't the fuel she was running on anymore. Evenings became her sanctuary. The world quieted down, her family dispersed into their separate corners of the house, and she'd retreat to her room with her notebook. Sometimes she'd write for hours. Sometimes she'd only manage a few lines before her mind wandered. But no matter how much or how little she wrote, the ritual anchored her. It became her way of reminding herself that she existed outside of the roles other people assigned her. And so, in these quiet rebellions, the steadier walk, the unfiltered voice, the private pages, Meg began shaping a new version of herself. Not a reinvention exactly, but an uncovering. She wasn't becoming someone else. She was simply allowing herself to be seen, even if only by herself at first. The town of Quahog, with all its chaos and absurdity, rolled on as though nothing had changed. But for Meg, the shift was seismic. She was no longer merely surviving the narrative others had written for her. She was editing, rewriting, even daring to start fresh chapters. And though no one else might have recognized it yet, she could feel it in the bones of her story. She was no longer just the background character. She was quietly and deliberately becoming the author. It was strange, really, how the streets of Quahog seemed to carry echoes of stories no one had told aloud. The old brick facades, the cracked sidewalks, the lamplights spilling in weak golden pools across empty corners. Each carried an unspoken memory, like the town itself was a scrapbook whose pages had been glued shut. Within this silent scrapbook, the Griffins had unknowingly been writing some of its darker chapters, and the people closest to them were the quiet witnesses who sometimes carried more truth than they cared to admit. On a night like this, the Griffin home was deceptively peaceful. The front porch light hummed softly, casting a faint halo on the welcome mat that had been there for years, faded now to an indistinct brown. Inside, the air was still, except for the occasional creak of old floorboards as the house settled. But behind closed doors, there was rarely such stillness in their world. The events leading up to this moment, small betrayals, overheard conversations, glances held too long, and secrets guarded too fiercely, were the kind of things that did not simply vanish when the lights went out. Lois, sitting alone at the kitchen table, was staring into a half-empty glass of wine, her mind drifting not to the day's chores or tomorrow's plans, but to the kind of thoughts that made people tighten their grip on a glass without realizing it. She had been hearing things lately, not voices, but shifts in tone, half-whispered fragments from behind doors. It wasn't paranoia so much as the faint sense that something was brewing within the family, a tension no one had named yet. Her instincts, sharp from years of reading people, told her this wasn't just about small domestic squabbles. This was something deeper. Upstairs, the hallway was dark except for the pale blue wash of moonlight sneaking in through a narrow window. Peter was snoring in their bedroom, a low rumble that seemed almost comforting in its predictability. But just 2 doors down, Meg sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, scrolling slowly, her face lit in shifting shades of cold light. She wasn't looking at anything particularly new. In fact, she was rereading old messages, replaying conversations in her mind, searching for some sign that she hadn't imagined the strange undercurrent she'd been feeling lately. People were behaving differently, not just in her family, but around her, as if there were silent alliances being formed without her knowledge. Chris, in the next room over, was sprawled on his bed with sketch pads scattered around him, his pencil moving slowly over paper. He wasn't drawing superheroes or cartoons tonight. Instead, his pages were filled with shapes and shadows, figures that seemed familiar but never fully formed, like he was trying to capture something on paper that he could not name aloud. Every so often, he'd pause, stare at the page, and then shade in the background darker, as if erasing the light from it on purpose. Meanwhile, Stewie was awake, though the rest of the house assumed otherwise. In the dim glow of his nightlight, he sat cross-legged in his crib with a small stack of papers hidden beneath his blanket. These were not just doodles or scribbles. They were careful notes, sketches, and timelines that only made sense to him. Stewie had noticed the subtle shifts before anyone else. He had a keen eye for patterns, and lately, the people in this house were acting as though they had stepped into a play they hadn't rehearsed for. Conversations felt staged, expressions lingered too long, and there was an almost imperceptible air of caution in how everyone moved around one another. The silence in the Griffin house wasn't peace. It was the pause between chapters, the kind that precedes a revelation. Later that night, when most of the house had given into sleep, Lois wandered into the living room. She stood by the window, pulling the curtain back, just enough to peer outside. It wasn't unusual for her to do this. She liked to watch the neighborhood, even at odd hours. But tonight her gaze lingered not on the street, but on the faint silhouette of a figure standing under the street lamp across the road. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't waving, wasn't doing anything at all, just watching. Lois stayed there for what felt like minutes, her breath quiet, before the figure slowly turned and walked away. The next morning, nothing was said about it. She didn't tell Peter. She didn't tell anyone. Some things were easier to tuck away, to wait, and see if they would resurface on their own. Breakfast was unusually subdued. Peter mumbled something about work while flipping through the paper. Meg ate in silence, and Chris avoided eye contact with anyone. Stewie sat in his high chair, spoon in hand, pretending to be engrossed in his oatmeal, though his mind was turning over the sight of Lois the night before. He had seen her at the window, seen the way she froze. Quahog, for all its oddities, had a rhythm to it. But when that rhythm faltered, when the familiar pattern broke, it created space for the kind of thoughts people usually didn't want to entertain. This was one of those times. Later that day, the small disruptions continued. A letter arrived in the mailbox with no return address, just the Griffin family's street and house number, scrawled in a rushed, almost careless hand. Peter opened it without much thought, expecting a bill or some junk mail. But what he pulled out was a single sheet of paper with no words, only a drawing. A house, their house, sketched in black ink with a single window shaded darker than the rest. He stared at it for a few seconds before chuckling awkwardly and tossing it aside, muttering something about weird neighbor kids. But Meg saw it too, and later so did Chris. And though no one said anything directly, they all thought the same thing. That it was strange, unsettling even, that someone had taken the time to draw their house and send it without explanation. That evening, the air in the living room was thicker, as though the day had weighed on everyone. Stewie noticed Peter's restless tapping on the arm of the couch, Meg's occasional glances toward the window, and Chris's absent-minded pacing near the kitchen doorway. He didn't say anything, but his mind was already cataloging each detail, each shift in their behavior. It was the little things, doors that were usually closed now left ajar, conversations ending abruptly when someone entered the room, and the faint sound of a car idling outside for longer than necessary. None of these moments were enough to cause alarm on their own, but together they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Lois, sitting in her armchair, kept her eyes on the television, but wasn't following the show. She was replaying the figure under the street lamp in her mind. The way it had stood so still, she wondered if anyone else had noticed, if she should bring it up, but something in her told her to wait, to see where this was going before she made it real by speaking it aloud. Outside, Quahog's night stretched on, shadows lengthening as the streetlights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and a faint hum of a passing car filled the still air. In this quiet, the Griffin family sat together yet apart, each holding onto a small piece of a puzzle they didn't know they were assembling. It was in these quieter moments, in the stillness between the chaos, that the paradox of Quahog became most apparent. For every bizarre headline, every absurd happening, every strange twist of fate, there was a thread of familiarity woven to the town's tapestry. A neighbor waving as they passed by, a familiar bell above the convenience store door, the sound of a distant lawnmower on a Sunday morning. These tiny constants were what anchored the Griffins, and everyone else, in a place that could so easily feel untethered from reality. And for Meg, those constants mattered. They gave her a sense that even if her own life was unpredictable, there was some underlying rhythm keeping the beat. But not everyone could see that rhythm. To some, Quahog was nothing more than a series of strange encounters and random punchlines, a place that seemed incapable of stringing together a coherent narrative. And yet Meg had learned that the town's peculiar structure was its structure, that its unpredictability was the only thing you could predict. Maybe that's why she stopped waiting for a normal day to come along. Instead, she found small joys in moments that might otherwise go unnoticed. The way the late afternoon light fell across Spooner Street, the comfort of an old hoodie on a chilly morning, the unspoken solidarity between two people sharing a silent nod at the bus stop. Chris understood that in his own way. His mind worked differently, less about patterns, more about instincts, but even he recognized that Quahog's oddness wasn't something to fight. It was something to lean into. He didn't worry about why something strange happened, only about what he could make of it. If a giant chicken fight broke out downtown, that wasn't a reason to be afraid. It was a reason to grab some popcorn and enjoy the free show. If a talking dog wandered into a conversation about municipal politics, well, that was just Wednesday. Together, Meg and Chris began to develop a sort of unspoken pact. Not one they declared out loud, but one they lived by. They would not be spectators in their own lives. They wouldn't stand in the background of Quahog's madness as if they were extras in someone else's story. Instead, they'd try, clumsily, imperfectly, to claim their own moments in the sun. Sometimes that meant stepping into situations they didn't fully understand. Sometimes it meant laughing at themselves when they stumbled. And sometimes it meant walking away from a situation without getting the last word, realizing that survival was victory enough. Their relationship wasn't without its rough patches. They were siblings, after all. Arguments were inevitable. There were mornings when they couldn't stand to be in the same room, afternoons when they took jabs at each other just to vent their own frustrations. But there was also a growing awareness that beneath the teasing, beneath the occasional outburst, there was a shared foundation they could both lean on. Neither of them might have admitted it outright, but they had each other's backs. That counted for something in a place like Quahog, where it was all too easy to feel alone in a crowd. Lois noticed the change, though she didn't comment on it much. She had her own hands full, keeping the house running, juggling Peter's antics, and navigating her own complicated friendships. But in quiet moments, she'd catch glimpses of Meg and Chris talking, their body language softer, their exchanges carrying an undercurrent of mutual respect. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd build an episode around. But it was there, steady and real. Brian noticed too, though his observations were often laced with sarcasm. He'd make passing remarks about the kids finally getting along, but deep down, he seemed to respect that Meg and Chris were carving out their own sense of belonging. Maybe he recognized something of his own journey and theirs, how easy it was to drift when you didn't feel anchored, and how important it was to find a tether, no matter how fragile. Peter, predictably, didn't notice much at all, or if he did, he interpreted it through his own warped lens. Once seeing Meg and Chris laughing together in the kitchen, he declared, "Ah, my two youngest bonding over our family's legacy of pranks." A statement that was entirely untrue, but one he seemed oddly proud of. Still, there was something oddly comforting in Peter's obliviousness. It reminded Meg and Chris that they didn't need validation from everyone to keep moving forward. Their progress was theirs, not something that had to be measured by how others saw it. And so, as the weeks rolled into months, the two of them kept navigating Quahog's unpredictable terrain. Some days were heavy with the weight of their own insecurities. Some were buoyant with unexpected laughter. And every now and then they'd find themselves in the middle of something so strange, so utterly absurd, that they'd catch each other's eye and silently agree, yes, this is our life, and somehow we're okay with that. It was on one of those Strangely ordinary yet extraordinary evenings that they found themselves on the front porch together, watching the street lamps flicker on. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of someone's backyard barbecue. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and a car with a broken muffler rumbled past. Meg leaned against the railing. Do you ever think about, I don't know, what we'd be like if we didn't grow up here? Chris tilted his head, considering. You mean like, if we lived in a normal town? Meg smiled faintly. Yeah, if we didn't have all this. Chris shrugged. I don't know. I think we'd still be us. Maybe a little less weird, but also maybe a little more boring. Meg chuckled softly. Yeah, maybe. They stood there for a while, not needing to fill the silence. It was one of those moments where words would only dilute the feeling, a quiet understanding that they were exactly where they were supposed to be, even if that place was absurd, frustrating, and endlessly unpredictable. And in the fading light, with the porch creaking softly beneath them, Meg realized that the unpredictability of Quahog wasn't something to endure until life got better. It was life. And if she could find her footing here, she could learn to laugh when things made no sense, to stand her ground when the chaos swelled, to hold on to the people who mattered, then maybe she'd be okay, no matter where she ended up. Chris, in his own way, seemed to sense the same thing. He gave her a small nod as if to say, we're in this together. And for once there was no sarcasm, no teasing, just the simple truth of it. Down the street, the lights in the Griffin house glowed warmly against the deepening night. Inside, dinner was probably getting cold, and Peter was probably telling a story that made no sense but had everyone laughing anyway. The world outside might have been wild, but for this moment, on this porch, everything felt enough. And with that quiet sense of enough settling over them, Meg and Chris turned and stepped back inside, ready to face whatever the next day, and the next twist of Quahog's strange rhythm would bring. It was in the quieter moments of Quahog's life that the strangest truths tended to emerge. The kinds of truths that didn't arrive with fanfare or breaking news, but slipped in through the cracks of routine, making themselves at home like uninvited guests. In the Griffin household, such moments often began as nothing more than a lazy morning, a half-forgotten breakfast, or the vague rustling of someone moving about upstairs long after the rest of the family had already started the day. But as history had taught anyone paying attention, a seemingly ordinary Sunday could carry the seeds of something extraordinary or deeply unsettling. Peter, of course, remained blissfully unaware of such subtleties, his mind fixed on whether the syrup bottle was running low. But Meg, by now far too used to being the quiet observer, noticed when things felt off. And lately, she'd been noticing them more and more. There had been a series of small oddities conversations that trailed off the moment she entered a room, glances exchanged between Lois and Brian that seemed to carry more weight than they should, and even the faint smell of cigarette smoke upstairs when nobody in the family smoked. For someone like Meg, the choice was always the same: ignore it and stay in her lane, or quietly investigate, knowing full well she might stumble across something she wished she hadn't. Curiosity, however, had always been her quiet rebellion against invisibility, and so she started to pay closer attention. The Griffin home had its own way of holding secrets, its creaky floorboards and paper-thin walls acting as both betrayers and conspirators. Late one night, unable to sleep, Meg had been passing by the attic door when she heard muffled voices drifting down from above. One of them was unmistakably Brian's, carrying that casual, confident lilt of his, but the other was lower, more deliberate, a voice she couldn't place. She lingered long enough to catch fragments, words like deal, deadline, and "Don't Tell Peter" reached her ears, but the context stayed stubbornly out of reach. When she finally heard footsteps moving toward the attic stairs, she hurried away, her heart hammering with a thrill she didn't fully understand. The next morning, the entire house seemed perfectly normal again. Lois was flipping pancakes, Peter was rambling about something he'd seen on late-night TV, and Brian was reading the newspaper with his usual air of mild superiority. No one mentioned the attic, and Meg didn't either. It was as if the previous night had been a strange dream, but the memory stuck with her like an itch she couldn't scratch. Over the following week, Meg's quiet watchfulness turned into a silent pursuit. She noticed that Brian's late-night absences were becoming more frequent, his excuses increasingly vague. Lois, too, seemed to have a subtle edge to her demeanor, a mix of distraction and guardedness that reminded Meg of someone trying to juggle too many fragile plates at once. Stewie, curiously enough, appeared more subdued during this period, spending less time concocting elaborate inventions and more time simply observing the rest of them with an almost conspiratorial stillness. There was one evening in particular that stood out. Rain had been falling in soft sheets all day, turning the air heavy and still. The family had gathered in the living room, Peter flipping aimlessly through channels while Chris tried to beat a video game on mute. Lois sat curled up on the couch with a book, though Meg noticed she hadn't turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. Brian, sitting on the arm of the couch, was absently swirling a glass of something amber-colored. His eyes kept darting toward the window as though expecting someone or something to appear. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, but in the muted hush of the rain, it cut through like a sharp note in a quiet song. Everyone turned toward the door. Peter didn't move, assuming it was probably a neighbor or a delivery, but Lois rose almost immediately, setting her book aside with unusual speed. She crossed the room, opened the door just enough to speak through the narrow gap, and whatever words passed between her and the visitor were lost under the sound of the rain. What caught Meg's attention was the way Lois's posture shifted, not defensive exactly, but careful, as if she were both protecting and hiding something at once. When she closed the door again, she didn't return to her seat, but instead moved toward the kitchen, gesturing for Brian to follow. The two disappeared into the other room, their voices low and quick. Peter, predictably, had already forgotten about the interruption, returning his attention to the TV. Chris didn't notice either, absorbed in his game. But Meg sat still, eyes fixed on the kitchen doorway, wondering just how much of her family's life happened outside her knowledge. That night, she decided to test her luck. Waiting until the rest of the house had settled into its nighttime rhythms, she crept toward the kitchen. The faint glow of the fridge light spilled across the tiles, but no one was there. She moved to the back door, half expecting it to be locked, and was surprised to find it slightly ajar. The cool night air slipped in, carrying with it a faint smell she recognized, the same cigarette smoke from the attic night. She stepped outside, scanning the yard, but found only the quiet hum of the street and the sound of rainwater dripping from the gutters. She was about to retreat when she spotted a small scrap of paper half buried in a patch of wet grass. Fishing it out, she found it was damp but still legible, a hastily scribbled note with an address, a time, and nothing else. The handwriting was messy, unfamiliar. She tucked it into her pocket and slipped back inside, heart thudding with the realization that she had something tangible now, not just vague impressions and overheard fragments. The address nagged at her all night. She didn't recognize it, but something about it felt deliberate. By morning, she'd made up her mind to see where it led. She told herself it was just curiosity, that she wasn't really getting involved in anything. But deep down, she knew this was about more than idle interest. This was about breaking through the invisible barrier that had always kept her on the outside looking in. When the time came, she left the house quietly, making up some excuse about going to the library. The address led her across town into a part of Quahog she didn't visit often, a stretch of older buildings with faded paint and narrow alleyways that seemed to hide more than they revealed. The note had specified 2 p.m., and she arrived a few minutes early, lingering across the street from the building in question. It was an unremarkable storefront, the kind you'd pass without a second glance. The sign above the door was faded beyond reading, and the windows were clouded from years of neglect. Yet as she watched, she saw Brian arrive, pausing briefly outside before slipping in through the door. Less than a minute later, Lois appeared as well, her expression unreadable. Meg stayed rooted in place, watching as the minutes stretched. Whatever was happening inside, she couldn't hear a thing. She debated going closer, maybe even trying the door, but before she could make a move, it opened again. This time, Lois and Brian emerged together, their conversation brisk and quiet. Brian carried a small, plain envelope, which he tucked into his jacket before they walked away in the opposite direction, neither of them noticing her in the shadows. Meg stood there long after they were gone, the damp air clinging to her. She didn't know what the envelope contained or who they had met inside that shop, but one thing was certain. The story unfolding in her family's life was far bigger than she had imagined. It was one of those evenings in Quahog where the sky seemed heavy with stories, painted in shades of dusty rose and faint gold, the air holding a quiet stillness that almost felt like a pause between heartbeats. Inside the Griffin house, the rhythm was slower than usual. The television hummed softly in the background, a familiar comfort more than a source of attention. In the kitchen, a soft lamp cast a warm pool of light over the table, where a half-finished crossword puzzle sat beside a cooling cup of tea. Lois moved around the kitchen in her own unhurried way, not quite cleaning, not quite cooking, more like letting her thoughts stretch out in the gentle space of the evening. There was a strange peace in moments like these, when nothing urgent called her, and she could simply exist without obligation. But Lois was never a woman who simply existed for long. Her mind always carried a subtle hum, weaving together strands of memory and tension, and that ever-present undercurrent of curiosity about life. She leaned against the counter, her hands resting on the cool surface, thinking about the days when her life had felt more malleable, back before everything had settled into familiar grooves, before marriage and children had turned the edges of her days into predictable shapes. It wasn't that she didn't love what she had, she did deeply, but Lois was honest enough with herself to admit that she sometimes missed the thrill of the unknown. And Quahog, for all its quirks, rarely offered real surprises anymore. At least not the kind that left your pulse racing in a way you couldn't explain. A faint sound drew her attention. Stewie's voice, lilting and deliberate, drifting from the living room. She peeked in to find him perched on the couch, speaking to Brian in that strangely adult cadence of his. Lois couldn't catch all the words, but she noticed the way Brian's expression flickered between skepticism and reluctant amusement. That little exchange was its own kind of magic, one she'd grown used to without realizing how extraordinary it was. Stepping back into the kitchen, she smiled faintly to herself. Parenthood had a strange way of hiding its treasures in plain sight. You only saw them clearly in moments like this, quiet, unremarkable minutes where nothing seemed to happen, yet everything was there. The doorbell rang, not in a rushed or frantic way, but with a calm, deliberate chime that seemed to announce itself without urgency. Lois wiped her hands on a dish towel and made her way to the door, pulling it open to reveal a face she hadn't expected to see. It wasn't someone from their immediate circle, No neighbor, no friend from the grocery store, no Peter-related acquaintance. This was a face from far deeper in her past. A man with eyes that held both recognition and restraint, as though he had rehearsed this moment in his mind many times before deciding to go through with it. "Lois," he said softly, his voice carrying that strange mixture of warmth and caution. For a heartbeat, her mind stalled. Then the name came to her like a pebble dropping into still water, quiet at first, but sending ripples through her entire sense of composure. "Daniel?" she breathed, stepping back without even realizing it. Daniel from the summer she had once called her wildest. Daniel who had existed like a half-forgotten chapter in her memory, filed away as something beautiful and untouchable. And here he was, standing on her porch like he had simply taken a wrong turn and ended up back in her life. "I was in town," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward the street, as though to prove his casualness, though the set of his shoulders betrayed something more deliberate. "Thought I'd stop by. See how you've been." Lois didn't quite know what to say. Her life was not built for unexpected guests from decades past. Yet she also knew that part of her had been waiting for something. Maybe not this, not exactly, but a reminder that her life story still had unwritten pages. She stepped aside to let him in, the air shifting subtly as he crossed the threshold. There was no awkward handshake or polite hug. Instead, they simply stood in the entryway for a moment, looking at each other with the unspoken understanding of two people who had once shared a secret language. Peter was out off with Cleveland and Quagmire for some ill-advised late-night activity, so the house was quieter than usual. The timing felt intentional, though Lois told herself it couldn't be. They settled at the kitchen table, the same warm pool of light now illuminating a space that suddenly felt less ordinary. They spoke in the measured way people do when catching up after many years, skimming over the obvious questions, dipping into stories about where they had been, who they had become. Daniel's voice was the same, though softer around the edges. His laugh still had that upward tilt at the end, like it carried its own private echo. Lois found herself studying him the way she might study an old photograph, looking for signs of the person she remembered and the ways time had redrawn him. She noticed the faint lines near his eyes, the way his hair had darkened, the deliberate pauses he took before answering certain questions. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she could feel the quiet hum of danger, not the kind that threatened her safety, but the kind that threatened the careful balance of a life she had built. There was nothing overt in his words, no declaration or suggestion, but history had its own gravity, and theirs was pulling just enough to make her notice. A sound from the living room broke the spell, a muffled giggle from Stewie, followed by Brian muttering something under his breath. Daniel smiled faintly at the interruption, leaning back in his chair. "You got a beautiful family, Lois," he said, and though his tone was sincere, there was a trace of something else beneath it. Not regret exactly, but the faint awareness of roads not taken. Lois felt that awareness, too, in the space between his words. She nodded, offering a small smile in return, but she didn't reply right away. Instead, she let the quiet linger, the ticking of the kitchen clock filling the space between them. The conversation drifted after that, lightening into safer topics. They spoke about places they had traveled, about the strange ways the world had changed, about the little things that had stayed the same. But Lois could feel the undercurrent running beneath it all, unspoken but undeniable. When Daniel finally stood to leave, the night outside had deepened into that velvety stillness where even the air feels slower. Lois walked him to the door, their steps quiet on the wooden floor. At the threshold, he hesitated for just a moment. as though weighing the words he wouldn't say. Then he offered her a smile, soft, knowing, final, and stepped back into the night. She closed the door gently, her hand lingering on the cool surface for a moment before letting go. The house felt unchanged, yet different somehow, as if a door inside her mind had been cracked open just enough to let the air shift. Lois returned to the kitchen, her tea now cold, the crossword still half finished. She sat down, picked up her pen, and filled in a word without thinking. But her mind was elsewhere, tracing the edges of a memory that felt both close and impossibly far away. And yet, for all the wild arcs of Stewie's life, the battles, the betrayals, the experiments, the moments of accidental tenderness, there remained a quiet undercurrent that connected it all. It was the strange, persistent tether between him and his family, a bond that seemed at times like a rope he wanted to cut, and at others like an anchor that kept him from floating too far into the void. This paradox was most visible in the way he treated Brian, the dog who was at once his greatest confidant and most frequent sparring partner. Their friendship was an odd one, built on wit, rivalry, and the occasional shared martini, but it held a consistency that much of Stewie's life lacked. Even when they disagreed, even when they went on misadventures that ended in chaos, there was a gravitational pull that brought them back together. Brian was often the one to witness Stewie's more vulnerable admissions, those fleeting moments when the walls came down and the child behind the chaos peeked out. But in this chapter of his life, Brian's role was more than just that of a sounding board. He became a mirror, a living reminder that Stewie's schemes, no matter how grand, could not erase the simple truth that connection mattered more than conquest. It was during one of their late-night living room talks, the kind that happened when everyone else was asleep, and the glow of the TV painted them in silver light, that Stewie let slip something unusual. Not a plan, not a threat, but a quiet, "I think I'm starting to care too much." The words were mumbled, almost as if he hadn't meant for them to leave his mouth, but Brian caught them. And for once, he didn't respond with a sarcasm or a joke. He just gave a small nod and kept sipping his drink. No speeches, no analysis, just being there. And maybe that was the strangest thing for Stewie, that the most profound shifts in his life didn't come from elaborate schemes or scientific breakthroughs, but from small human moments like that. They were inconvenient in a way. Feelings, after all, didn't fit neatly into the blueprints of his mind. They didn't obey the rules of physics or strategy. They crept in uninvited, altering the course of his plans without warning. And as much as Stewie pretended to resist them, part of him couldn't help but be curious about what it might mean to truly let them in. At the same time, this softer thread was woven into a much darker fabric. For even in the midst of personal reflection, Stewie's more dangerous impulses hadn't vanished. They'd only evolved. He began to experiment not just with inventions, but with ideas. Ideas about how far morality could bend before it broke. Ideas about how much control one person could exert over the fate of others without becoming something monstrous. And while Brian occasionally acted as a counterweight to these musings, there were nights when Stewie sat alone in his room, sketching designs or scribbling equations that seemed to hum with the faint, cold promise of something far more dangerous than any of his previous escapades. It was during one of these solitary stretches that Lois wandered in. She didn't knock, of course. Lois never did. She simply opened the door, holding a basket of laundry, and gave him that maternal look that was half question, half judgment. Stewie, caught off guard, tried to slide his notebook under a pile of toys, but Lois's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. Then, without a word, she set the laundry down and left. It was such a small interaction, but it stuck with him. He didn't know if she had seen the equations, if she had recognized the darker undercurrents in his work. But the possibility that she was aware of more than she let on, planted a strange seed of discomfort in him. For all his resentment toward Lois, there was a part of Stewie that operated differently when she was around. She was both the source of his earliest frustrations and, paradoxically, the figure whose approval he sometimes seemed to crave without realizing it. And lately there were moments, quick, easily missed, where her glances toward him carried something beyond the usual motherly oversight. Something like worry. Stewie didn't quite know what to do with that. Worry wasn't power, worry wasn't control, but it was attention, and attention was a currency he understood all too well. Meanwhile, the house itself was shifting in small, barely noticeable ways. The rhythm of the Griffin household was changing. With Peter caught up in his latest string of absurd misadventures, Meg buried in her own quiet struggles, and Chris orbiting somewhere between innocent distraction and sudden bursts of insight. These shifting dynamics meant that Stewie had more room to maneuver, but also fewer predictable constants to anchor himself to. The chaos was both freeing and unsettling. It meant opportunity. But it also meant unpredictability, and unpredictability was something Stewie preferred to dish out, not deal with. Yet in this environment of flux, his imagination seemed sharper than ever. Ideas bloomed faster, more vividly, and the line between his harmless projects and dangerous experiments grew thinner. He began to toy with concepts that blurred not just ethics, but reality itself. Machines that could rewrite memories, devices that could subtly alter behavior without the subject ever knowing. It was intoxicating. The thought that he could shape the very fabric of someone's mind without them suspecting a thing. But it also brought him dangerously close to a truth he'd long tried to avoid. That absolute power wasn't simply about domination. It was about responsibility. And responsibility, for someone like Stewie, was far more terrifying than any of his enemies. Still, there were lighter days. Afternoons where he abandoned his experiments to join Brian on the couch, or where he followed Peter into some absurd quest for an ice cream flavor that supposedly didn't exist anymore. Those moments were infuriating in their ability to distract him from his grander goals, but also strangely grounding. It was as though, without realizing it, Stewie was being tugged back toward the messy, unpredictable warmth of human connection, even as he continued to drift toward colder, more calculated pursuits. And maybe that's where the true tension of this chapter lay, not in a singular plot or grand scheme, but in the quiet war between two versions of himself. One that sought to control, to dominate, to stand apart from the world, and one that was slowly learning the uncomfortable truth that to live in the world meant, in some way, to be changed by it. The danger, of course, was that he might never be able to fully choose between them, and that his inability to do so could one day prove more destructive than any invention he could ever build. Under the soft glow of late afternoon, Meg's life, once again, found itself at the mercy of a peculiar twist. It began with something small, an overheard conversation in the kitchen while she was pouring herself a glass of water. Lois was on the phone, her voice hushed but urgent, talking to someone Meg didn't recognize. The words were muffled, but there was something in the way her mother said, "She's not ready for that," that sent a shiver down Meg's spine. It was the same tone people used when they were hiding something for someone's own good, which usually meant it was exactly the thing they needed to know. That little thread of curiosity was enough to pull her into a spiral of late-night thoughts. And it wasn't long before Meg began piecing together clues. She noticed how her mail had been sorted before she got to it, how Brian seemed oddly protective around her lately, and how Peter, bless his lack of subtlety, kept dropping comments about keeping secrets whenever the topic of her future came up. It was like living in a house where everyone knew the punchline to a joke, except her. The discovery, when it finally came, didn't crash into her all at once. It seeped in slowly, in fragments, an old yearbook photo she'd never seen, a letter half burned in the fireplace, and finally a meeting with a stranger who seemed to know her far too well. He claimed to be a friend of her biological father. The words hit her like a soft but unstoppable wave. Her father, the man she thought she knew, wasn't her father at all, or at least not the one who'd contributed to the blueprint of her DNA. Peter had been her dad in every way that mattered, but biologically, the truth was different. It should have been earth-shattering, but strangely, it wasn't. Maybe because Meg had always felt like an outsider in her own family, or maybe because the idea of Peter being her real father had always been more of a heart-based truth than a biological fact. Still, the revelation made her see things in a different light. She found herself wondering how much of who she was had been shaped by this hidden truth, and how much had been shaped by simply surviving the chaos of the Griffins. Instead of running from the revelation, Meg leaned into it. She tracked down bits and pieces about her biological father, not to replace Peter, but to fill in a part of herself that had always been missing. She learned he'd been an artist, someone who loved quiet mornings and loud music, someone who didn't quite fit into the world but left his mark anyway. In a strange way, it gave her comfort to know that maybe her oddness had roots that went deeper than Quahog's everyday madness. Meanwhile, her relationship with Peter didn't crumble the way some people might have expected. If anything, it became stronger. Peter, in his own bumbling way, reassured her that he didn't care about the biological part. He was her dad, period. He'd been there for the scraped knees, the awkward school dances, and the times she needed someone to yell at telemarketers on her behalf. Biology couldn't replace that kind of love. With this new perspective, Meg started carrying herself differently. Not louder, not necessarily more confident, but with the kind of quiet steadiness that made her feel grounded for the first time in a long while. She didn't need to chase her family's approval in the same desperate way. Instead, she focused on building a life that felt like hers. It was around this time that she stumbled into photography, quite literally. Chris had left an old camera lying around, and Meg, bored one afternoon, started clicking away. At first, it was just silly shots of the backyard or candid moments of Brian rolling his eyes at Peter. But soon she found herself captivated by the way a single frame could hold 1,000 unspoken words. She began taking long walks, camera in hand, capturing tiny details most people missed. The way sunlight scattered through a cracked window, the lonely beauty of an empty swing, the raw emotion, the stranger's face at the bus stop. Photography became her therapy, her way of seeing the world without feeling crushed by it. And in the quiet click of the shutter, she found something she'd been searching for her whole life, a voice that didn't need anyone else's permission to exist. By the time summer rolled around, Meg had filled several shoeboxes with developed photos, each one a fragment of the way she saw the world. When she finally decided to display them at a local art fair, she didn't tell her family, not because she didn't want them there, but because she wanted to see if she could stand on her own without their validation. The fair was small, but for Meg it was monumental. People she'd never met stopped to admire her work, some even buying prints. There was no applause, no dramatic spotlight, but for the first time, Meg felt the quiet, steady weight of self-worth settle in her bones. She walked home that night under a sky scattered with stars, her camera swinging gently at her side. The Griffins would always be chaotic, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel in their humor, but Meg had found a piece of herself they couldn't touch. She had her truth, her art, and the quiet strength to carry them forward. And for once, that was enough. The rain outside had slowed to a delicate drizzle, tapping softly against the glass like the faint ticking of an old clock. The Griffin home seemed strangely calm in this moment. The storm of confessions, confrontations, and uncomfortable truths finally quieting into something that felt survivable. Lois stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, eyes unfocused as she stared out the window. Behind her, Peter was attempting, rather poorly, to fix a squeaky cabinet door, humming to himself like the previous arguments had been completely erased from his mind. Meg passed through the kitchen, pausing for a moment. She didn't say anything at first, just lingered there, shifting her weight, her eyes catching on her mother's stillness. Lois turned slightly, noticing her daughter, and for a brief, unspoken moment, they shared a look that carried the weight of every misunderstanding they had ever had. No words were exchanged, yet somehow there was an acknowledgement, a small one, that maybe things could be different. Not perfect, not even close to perfect, but different. Chris wandered in next, holding Stewie's hand. Stewie was carrying what looked like a makeshift storm survival kit, stuffed with crackers, juice boxes, and, inexplicably, a small flashlight shaped like a penguin. Chris cheerfully announced, "We're ready in case the power goes out." Lois smiled faintly, her first genuine smile in hours. Even in a house full of chaos, there was still space for these small, strange, comforting moments. Brian padded in quietly, his fur still slightly damp from a walk outside. He shook himself off, then hopped up onto a chair, watching everyone with those weary, knowing eyes. "You know," he started, "it's not often this place feels quiet." His voice wasn't sarcastic for once, it was almost reflective. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind that let everyone breathe. Outside, the drizzle slowed further until the air was still. The world beyond Spooner Street looked washed clean, the puddles in the driveway catching pale reflections of the streetlights. The house seemed to settle too, like even the walls were exhaling after holding in too much tension. In the living room, Peter eventually gave up on the cabinet and joined the others, flopping down on the couch in his usual dramatic fashion. He didn't say anything, didn't crack a joke, didn't launch into some bizarre story about a chicken fight. He just sat there, idly flipping channels until a soft old sitcom laugh track filled the room. It was almost disarming in its normalcy. Lois carried her tea into the living room and sat beside him. Meg took a spot in the armchair, curling up with her phone, but occasionally glancing over at the TV. Chris and Stewie built a small fort out of couch cushions and blankets on the floor, their laughter muffled but warm. Even Brian, usually quick to retreat upstairs, stayed close by, curling up on the rug. The moment wasn't grand or cinematic. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no sweeping speeches about family. Instead, there was something quieter, something more real, a shared presence. They were all here, together. After everything, that was enough. Lois leaned back slightly, sipping her tea, her eyes wandering over her family. She thought about all the versions of this house, the loud ones, the angry ones, the absurd ones, and how they all seemed to blend into this strange, imperfect life they shared. She didn't need to forgive everything tonight. She didn't need to understand everyone's choices. But she could be here, in this moment, without feeling like she was drowning in the noise. Peter glanced over at her and, in his own simple way, seemed to sense that something was different. He gave her a small smile. It wasn't his usual goofy grin. It was quieter, almost shy. Lois returned it, and for a fleeting second, it felt like the chaos might just be manageable. Oh, the sitcom on the TV rolled into another scene, the canned laughter blending with the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Stewie peeked his head out of the fort, his hair slightly messed, and muttered, "Well, this has been a remarkably unproductive day, but not entirely unpleasant." He ducked back inside before anyone could respond. Brian chuckled under his breath. "That's about as close as you're going to get to a compliment from him," he said, his voice carrying that mix of cynicism and warmth he reserved for rare occasions. Outside, the clouds began to part, revealing faint streaks of moonlight that slipped across the living room floor. The rainwater on the street shimmered faintly, and the quiet of Quahog returned like an old friend. No one moved to turn off the TV. No one rushed to clean up the mess of blankets, snacks, or abandoned tools in the kitchen. The house was a little cluttered, a little mismatched, just like its inhabitants. And in that stillness, there was something close to peace. Not a permanent peace. Not the kind that erases arguments or prevents future disasters, but the kind that shows up after the storm passes, reminding you that, despite everything, you're still standing. The night stretched on, carrying the gentle rhythm of a household finally at rest. Upstairs, the bedrooms waited. Tomorrow would come with its own share of noise, awkward conversations, and ridiculous misadventures. But for now, there was only the soft hum of togetherness, holding the family like an invisible thread. Because in the Griffin household, peace isn't a constant, it's a visitor. And tonight, it had decided to stay just a little longer.